p.m., so we're going to call the Castle Hills Zoning Commission meeting to order on June 6, 2017, meeting at the City of Castle Hills City Hall, City Council Chambers at 209 Lemonwood Drive in Castle Hills. Item number 2, or let me just state for the record that we have a quorum here today. Commissioners represented are Mr. Aiken, Ms. Baker, Mr. Gray, Mr. Flynn, and the Chairman, Joe Isbrand. Item number 2, consider approval of the February 7, 2017 Zoning Commission meeting minutes. We do not have those yet available to us, so we will table that until we next meet. Item number 3, consider a request from City Council to change Section 50-564A, Notice of Public Hearings of the City Zoning Ordinance by providing public notice of Board of Adjustment public hearings on the city website in compliance with Local Government Code 211.010D. Commissioners, if you remember, this came before us last time, and I believe that our vote to support this was unanimous to make that recommendation. However, procedurally, we did not hold a public hearing to make available to the public the opportunity to comment on that. So we'll go through that process this evening so that we can formalize this process. So at 7:04 p.m., we're going to open the public hearing on item number 3. Is there any member of the community who wishes to speak on this item? We'll ask one more time. There's so many out here. I want to make sure we can see their hands if they raise them. Okay, we'll close the public hearing then at 7:05 p.m. And just to make sure that we're doing this correctly, I want to ask for a motion, second, and vote again so we have it back on the record following the public hearing. Do I have a motion? No, Mr. Gray, your motion is, and Mr. Aiken seconded, to recommend to City Council the change of Section 50-564A, public hearings for the Board of Adjustment. Any discussion on this matter? All in favor indicate by raising your hand. It's unanimous. Thank you very much. All right. Oh, okay. I see. The aura. Item number 4, consider the recommendations from the Zoning Review Committee regarding the city zoning ordinance. We have again with us tonight Mr. Mark Schnall, the chair of the Zoning Review Committee, to help walk us through this. We're going to do this as a public hearing so that as we go through this, if anyone does want to comment, they're invited to do so and encouraged to do so. So we will open up the public hearing on this item at 7:06 p.m. Mr. Schnall.
Mr. Chairman, before we get started, can I suggest that we go through this by exception rather than going through everything? We could just go through and say, this is the one I'd like to discuss, and I think it might speed things up a little bit.
Okay. Are we good with that? Mr. Schnall, do you have any opening comments or observations you want to make before we go through this?
No, sir.
Okay. Mr. Flynn, your suggestions go through by section, so section 50-1. Is that the way you're intending this to be?
I do have one question.
By exception.
By
So
exception.
we only discuss
I'm sorry, I
the
thought
things
you
we
said by section.
Yeah, the only things we
Okay.
have take exception to.
Okay. Okay, very good. Ms. Baker?
I just have one question. If we do that, are we somehow impinging on the right of citizens to have open forum? I don't know.
It would be my expectation that prior to completing this process, we would hold a public hearing to allow the community to comment on what we believe is the draft prior to our vote.
Yeah.
prior to the vote of our recommendation to council.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I think there's still a lot of verbiage that needs to be added,
Yeah.
according to the comments.
Yeah, but I will say that at any time, if any member of the public wants to comment on an item that is not specifically raised here, we encourage them to do so. We need the public's input on this. All right, does that sound like our approach then? Okay, very good. So let's begin with exceptions. Mr. Flynn, did you want to start?
Well, I'll start. On page 4, where it talks about the definition for landscaped areas. Devoted to and consist of plant material, including but not limited to, it's referring primarily to organic material. And the comment over here, comment T13, refers back to that. And I guess what I'm getting at is, how does that affect xeriscaping? Where you're using, rock, gravel, things of that nature. Do we still have to have, I think, 30% or more in plant material for a yard?
Mr. Vanderwall, are you going to comment on the items specific to the city staff's input on this?
Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Janet Thielen. She's forgotten more about zoning than I know, so we're going to let her make comments if that's okay, Joe.
That would be terrific.
This comment was just put in for a point of discussion. As far as looking at the balance, if you're comfortable with it, leave it as is, and you'll see a lot of my comments are really, this is not zoning according to Janet, it's really your zoning. I just threw some talking points in there for some of these, and this is one of those.
Well, and I think that's what I'm getting to. It says that the last sentence there on that paragraph, the use of stone, brick, stone, aggregate, or other inorganic material should not be greater in total area than that of organic plant material. And I'm not sure if we want to do that. I understand how some municipalities would feel that way, but we are in a semi-desert area where water is at a premium. And I think if somebody wants to go ahead and completely xeriscape their yard, I think it's advisable, or we should not, they could be able to do that.
A couple of comments, because of the size of your lots, you're talking about an awful lot of stone, and I don't know what Mr. Schnall's experiences have been. Unfortunately, it always sounds so good. I'm never going to have to mow again. I just haven't figured out how you control the nut grass and a few other the insidious things that come up. And sometimes this xeriscape takes a whole lot of work when you go with just stone.
No, I understand that.
That people don't always do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, finding a balance is important, and it's up to you guys, and I don't know that you want to go 100%. I just think that's an excessive amount. I would not want to see my next-door neighbor's yard be one big giant rock.
Yeah.
It's just kind of unattractive, considering the beauty that you have in Castle Hills. But I think there should be some balance.
Yeah, I understand. And, I don't know what the right number is. I just want to make sure that we're not necessarily.
I think it's a very valid point. The question I have is also, is this retroactive, or does this go into effect and then it becomes everyone has to abide by it? Because we have a couple of yards in our area that are xeriscaped already. They already are in violation of that, I guess, I would say.
A couple of comments. First, to answer you directly, if the ordinance is changed, existing conditions on the ground are grandfathered until they are abandoned. And there's a section in the code about the period of time it takes for something to be considered abandoned and therefore no longer permitted. On the xeriscape, I might be the person who has lived in Castle Hills the longest, I don't know. I moved into Castle Hills in October of 1978. At that time, the city's letterhead said, "A city of beautiful homes." I'm sure you all might have seen that letterhead. So, I think that the balance that the city secretary described is appropriate. I also think that if someone does truly want to have a zero-scape yard, they can file for a variance and convince the Board of Adjustment that it would be appropriate. I mean, I agree that, you know, we all need to be very water conscious, and Xeriscape is a great way to do that. My yard has been entirely organic as far back as I can remember because my wife won't let it be anything else. And that also is a water-saving technique. But I think there is a remedy for a homeowner who wants to have Xeriscape, and that remedy is to seek a variance from this requirement if it applies to their property and they want to do something along the Xeriscape lines.
Can we put something in there that they can seek a variance? And that brings up another issue. Let's assume that people really do want to do xeriscaping. Are there any ordinances for maintaining that xeriscape? Because there's a house near my yard, a house near my house that looks like it's been completely xeriscaped, and they've kind of let it go. So there are a lot of weeds coming up, and it, you know, so I don't know if there's any kind of ordinance for that.
Under the standard weed ordinance that we have for height?
I don't know.
I would think it would.
Yeah, there may be a nuisance ordinance that would cover this, a high growth of vegetation ordinance. There certainly is in the cities where I'm city attorney, but I haven't looked at the ordinance here in a long time.
It would be the standard 12-inch for
Okay.
weeds and
Okay.
unwanted vegetation.
And the variance procedure is set out in the local government code. And information about the variance procedure, I'm sure, would be provided by city staff if someone made a request. Plus, there's also the question of who's going to enforce this? I mean, who's going to go out with a tape measure and a calculator and figure out, well, it's only 28% or something like that? I mean, it would be, you know, obvious since someone took one of our huge front lawns in Castle Hills Estates and turned it into gravel. That people would notice. But I think that's a very unlikely circumstance.
I guess I just wonder, though, you have saws out there actively offering all kinds of incentives for people to do this. Maybe somebody does want to turn their entire front yard into a xeriscaped space. Are we, in fact, discouraging this from taking place, and is that the intention of this? And it feels a little bit in conflict to me you have our water entity encouraging it, and the city saying, no, you can't go beyond a certain point unless you go through pardon the expression, the bureaucratic process of coming to seek a variance and jumping through all the hoops to do that. So I don't know.
Well, the text states that it shall not be greater than, in total area, than organic plant material. So you're looking at a 50-50 mix.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems pretty reasonable to me, I guess.
I would also venture to say, most people, when they buy a home or want to change their yard, probably are not aware that there is a code for that. So they would find out after the fact by having someone say, you shouldn't have done that. So I don't know how we create awareness if, in fact, that's what we pass.
Are there other thoughts on this?
Can you turn your mic on, please? Thank you.
I think I'm good with the 50% as a place as to be defined in here. Understand the comments. When you think about all the residences have front and backyards, and it's just pretty unlikely that somebody's going to xeriscape the whole yard, I think. So it's probably a good place to start. I think I'm good with it from that standpoint, so.
Ms. Baker, any comment?
I don't really have an objection with 30 or 50. I do think that having limitations on how weedy you can get, because I've seen some xeriscape that just looks like it went rabid and wild. It's just weeds, but somebody's weed is somebody's xeriscape plant. So I don't really know that I have a real clear
And again, I would come back to the fact that we have regulations in place for the size and the height and the, which will protect us if we need to make a complaint or something like that.
So how would y'all like to proceed on this?
I guess, after the discussion, I think we can just leave it like it is. I just wanted
As is.
to make sure we were
No, it's a good discussion.
considering everything, so I think 50% is plenty.
Okay.
So there is one comment down here that, I guess, Janet, you wrote on regarding the commercial, and I don't know if you were, in fact, I guess it takes us kind of to a procedural. There's a lot of notes here that are really good. So is the process for us to talk about it, and then the staff is going to go back and with Mark and insert somebody? I mean, what are we going to do with all of your notes? What's the plan?
That's kind of up to you guys. And you're right, the reason that was in there was not so much residential as it was commercial, because often we see they have very little green to begin with,
Right.
and maybe they do have a lot of drainage problem, and so they put in more of the rock usage, or, so the appearances, and maybe it's even a bioswale, but the top is all rock. That was kind of where my mind was going on that. To answer your question, it's up to you guys how you want to do it. If you want to direct staff to craft other language, if you like it as is. I mean, these were just, I went through and looked at a lot of cities' ordinances, and then what we walk in the door day-to-day issues, and just, so it's kind of up to you. I know this is a cumbersome process.
And you bring up a point, you know, there are a lot of comments in here, and they're very good comments.
Yes.
I mean, I read through the whole thing today. But my concern is, there's still comments that may be incorporated. I don't want to go through this whole exercise, and then we incorporate the comments,
Final
and we do this all over again.
Yeah.
So, you know, would anybody entertain the idea, or I don't want to delay anything either, but if we've got these many comments, wouldn't it be worthwhile to put all those comments in there as they are, and then we review it?
I think my personal preference would be for us to go through these and discuss them as we see a need or desire to have them added, to ask city staff to insert them. Otherwise, I think we could create a very big document and end up taking a lot out of it, or having to be careful to go through it line by line to take out of it, versus going through it tonight in our next meeting, however long it takes, giving the staff clear sense of what we would like to see added in, have them bring back the next iteration of it, have us look at that again, fine tune that. Then I would hope that after that, we would be at the stage to hold a public hearing, say, this is the document that we are considering presenting to council. Public, please weigh in on this,
Okay.
and then to take a vote on it.
Okay.
Well, I think if that's the approach, which I think is a good one, then I think with respect to this paragraph, which I didn't even read before, or if I read it, I didn't pick up on it, but I think it's a good one to discuss. We probably should have staff address the commercial, because I think it's going to be totally different than residential. And in that case, the 50% probably makes no sense, or little sense for many commercials. So that may be a paragraph that we want to say, hey, we're good with this for the residential, but let's get staff or Mark or whoever, you know, these guys out here to put something in that addresses commercial, because I think it's probably needed.
Mark, I have a
Mr.
comment.
Chair, there's a whole section later in your ordinance that's titled Commercial Landscaping.
Okay.
And it seems to me that, to follow Mr. Aiken's suggestion, it would be appropriate to simply have the commission request the city staff review sections 50-512 through 50-515 and bring back to the commission any changes to those sections. And that's where, for example, the concept about special landscaping rules for commercial districts could be inserted. Interestingly enough, the definition that we just spent a few minutes talking about no change was recommended to that section by the Zoning Review Committee. But if we're going to talk about commercial landscaping, the logical place to do that is in the section of the ordinance captioned commercial landscaping.
One of my thoughts, and because this is a little bit confusing, commercial landscaping is really only required if you are getting an SUP. If you read through there, yeah, that's what I said. The references are all for SUP, it's placed in an odd place being in zoning and not over in section 48 with the rest of our vegetation. To me, it almost seems that this ends up being part of architectural review, and it's in the rest of our vegetation chapters and not part of zoning. Just a thought of laying out the code slightly differently. I don't know, how do your cities do it? I might not have looked at your cities, I looked at a lot.
I've not looked at this specifically in the cities I represent, but I think it's logical to have a definition of landscaped areas in the zoning ordinance.
Right.
And I think it's logical to centralize all of your landscape rules in a landscape ordinance, which does not have to be in the zoning ordinance.
And we could
Zoning
just
is-
cite a
Zoning
reference.
is land use.
Right.
So landscape is in a kind of a gray area, but it really does fall more in the area of architectural review perhaps, and certainly more in an area where you have the other requirements about landscape.
The other flip side to moving it to vegetation is if we have another, I'll call it the plague, right now it's oak wilt, but if something else comes through, and we stay in touch with Texas Forestry, as changes come, it's less cumbersome to make changes to the vegetation ordinance than it is the zoning ordinance. And it's easier for us to keep it more contemporary and as things change. Just
I guess
thoughts.
I'd like to see it move to vegetation or its own little entity.
And be
rather than to have
referenced
to look
here.
under commercial and then look up commercial landscaping, residential, look up residential landscaping rules.
And that can be done easily. Some of the things that are missing in here is, when you go into Muni codes especially, we pay to have references where it brings the box up and you can see it right there in the balloon. This code doesn't have a lot of those references cited, and because of the lack of that, you don't know where to look for things. And so, I'll be honest with you, I worked here quite a while before I stumbled across commercial landscape and went, "Oh, it's in SUPs?" So I may have dropped the ball on a few projects, I don't know. So just cleaning things up into a more usable order for developers when they're looking for things, it makes sense to go to a vegetation ordinance to look at vegetation. So give us direction and we can work on it accordingly.
All right, other comments on this? Do we have a clarity of what we're looking for here to help
Let me see if we- if I-
Stalen
if I-
figure it out when we go back to work on it again?
Let me see if I understand it correctly. Are we going to put all the landscaping in a vegetation ordinance and then reference that ordinance in here?
We can.
I think that would be an ideal way to do it,
And
frankly.
and it could be in part of SUP that you have to meet certain vegetation standards. Those standards would be over in the vegetation.
It'll simplify this
Yes, sir.
and make it easier for people to find out what they need to find.
We good?
Streamlining.
Right.
Does that work for everybody?
Yes.
That took 15 minutes, thank you. No.
We're halfway through page 4.
Not that I'm keeping track, but
Mr. Chairman, I would like to suggest that we go page by page and
That's,
say,
I
do we have any exceptions for page 1?
Yeah, and I think, Mr. Flynn, if you're good, since you originally brought this up, I think
That's the
that's
way to do it.
probably what we need to
So that
do.
everybody can comment at the same time on the same
Right,
page.
all right,
Because I already have stuff for 3 and you've skipped to 4.
okay. All right, so
so now we're going backwards.
may we back up 30 minutes in and go to back to page 3? Or let's go to, okay.
Page 1. Any
All right,
issues?
are there any exceptions or other comments regarding page 1?
No.
No.
Any exceptions or comments regarding page 2?
No.
No.
Mr. Schnall, I'm also looking for you to weigh in as we go through this, right?
I will not be shy. I
Thank
have
you,
no
sir.
comments.
Are you comfortable with what you're reading here, or do we need to have any kind of discussion?
Well, I read it already,
Okay,
so I've
Yeah.
highlighted everything that I have a question
Okay,
on or
perfect.
an issue with.
The question I have is where there is suggested alternate
Right, yeah.
language, is it kind of concurrence by silence then? If you don't speak about it, you would like us to change the language out that's in the code for what's shown in the comment box? Is that the general consensus? Or is it, unless we discuss it, we leave the code as is and we disregard what's in the comment
Yeah,
box?
and thank you for asking for that clarification, because, yeah, we need to look
So-
at that.
so-
Are we
With comments then.
comfortable with language as is, or where there are comments, do we want to adopt that or discuss that?
So before we go down that road, Mr. Chairman, if we can ask Janet to kind of explain why she inserted the comments and how she came about inserting those comments, I think that would be helpful for you to understand kind of her methodology as we did this, and
Okay.
then you can weigh that. So Janet, you wanna discuss it?
Janet, comment number 1 of 58.
Okay, I'll talk fast. Assisted living, I know that this language that's over here was vetted pretty heavily by another attorney on another zoning issue that I had worked with, and this really really closely covers. Unfortunately, I know that DADS is disappearing as of September 1, I think, so it becomes Department of Health, Human Services. So this is already antiquated and will need to be corrected, so I will make a notation of that update.
So I want you to speak to your general methodology.
Right.
So for all your comments, you felt our code was deficient in some regard in the way that you've dealt with it in the past, and so you went out and looked at other cities' codes and found what you felt was the best definitions or best alternate language that we could possibly pull to strengthen our code of ordinances, and that's how we wound up with the comments on the side of the page.
Thank you,
So-
yes.
And I'm sorry, did you say that you found portions insufficient, and that's why you went to look at this? Is that what you?
Correct,
said?
or there was a definition that's not in there, and then I'll ask Mr. Schnall, what's your suggestion on ones where there's a definition, but it's not used anywhere in the code?
Take it out.
Okay, so those are
If you don't
noted.
need it, take it out.
Yeah, so that was the other thing I was looking for, and I did kind of take every single one of them and run a word search on them and look to see if they were even in our code.
Okay.
So that's kind of where we are.
So,
My suggestion on I'm sorry, go ahead. Mark. So my suggestion on the general methodology is review the language at the right, kind of do a comparative analysis with the one on the left, and let's agree that, and I don't know if you want to vote on each one or just say, what do you think about leaving this, using what's in there already, or what do you think about leaving in comment, or in the comments on the right-hand side? Or maybe have a discussion on those, Mr. Chair. That's what I think we should do, to consider whether you swap those in or out. And again, I'm going to apologize to Mr. Schnall, because a lot of this was not raised by the zoning review committee. But I had asked Janet, take a look at it, since the zoning commission's taking a look at the zoning ordinance, if there's a way that we can strengthen it in your experience and dealing with it for the last few years with the city. Please feel free to make recommendations. So again, I apologize to Mr. Schnall, because some of this is kind of probably catching him blind, or catching him, blindsiding him a little bit, and I apologize for that.
And I guess what I want to make sure is the charge for the committee that Mr. Schnall has chaired has brought us, they have brought us their recommendations, and that's what we were working from. And I appreciate the efforts of everyone to contribute more perspective to it, but I think it's important to me, and particularly for me, it's important to hear from Mr. Schnall representing that committee of whether this is an enhancement necessary or unnecessary or whatever, so that we can try to find the proper blend of what the intention of city staff was, what the intention of the committee was.
I think the intention of the committee was to do as little damage to our zoning ordinance as possible, to try to add definitions of terms that were used in the ordinance but were not defined, to not define words that have a typical dictionary definition that do not need to be defined, because a court will look to that definition if there's a question, and to be respectful to those who came before us, who drafted various portions of the zoning ordinance. So we did not do an extensive compare to other city ordinances. We did look to a couple of cities that we felt were comparable to Castle Hills, to craft several of the newer sections that we added. But for the most part, we tried to use ordinary language and definitions, add definitions of terms that were used in the ordinance and not defined, where there could be a misunderstanding of what the meaning intended was. And And that, really, that same concept, I think, carries throughout. The section about planned unit developments was tailored, for example, off of a ordinance in the city of Chavano Park, where I happen to know the mayor. The ordinance on solar, which I'm the primary author of, came from another community outside the state of Texas, because I couldn't find anything in the state of Texas that was simple enough to fit our community. And that's sort of where we're coming from. I leave to the discretion of this zoning commission how to deal with staff's recommendations. I think, as Janet already pointed out, the definition she's got there, which references the Texas Department of Aging and Disability Services, will be outdated on September 1 of this year, because that's probably when that bill that changes the name of the agency is going to become effective, assuming Governor Abbott signs it or doesn't veto it. So the risk in getting a definition as detailed as this is a factor. I mean, this is a very thorough definition of assisted living facility. And I can't quarrel with just about anything in it, except that you may be asked to amend it at some point in the future when the state changes the name of the agency back from Department of Human Services to Department of Aging and Disability Services, because my wife used to work for an agency called the Texas Department of Human Services years ago.
Do you feel that the description of assisted living as it currently stands is adequate, or that any of those other elements are necessary to make more clear something that is vague in the current definition?
I was comfortable with the current definition, Mr. Chair, but I bring my committee's recommendation to the zoning commission for your judgment and evaluation, and I appreciate the work that the city staff, Janet in particular, has done to bring other ideas to the commission.
Likewise, I think we all share that. We know this has been laborious for everybody involved, and we really appreciate the thoroughness of it. I think there is a point, though, during this discussion where we should weigh, is it clear enough, or does it really necessitate some greater definition to it?
I'm leaning his direction.
He's talked to you?
No, just from what I sat down and read the changes of the state law upcoming, then it starts to appear very quickly that these become antiquated every 2 years if you're not careful. And that is very problematic.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your idea on brevity. It puts my smarty pants in its place, trust me.
That was not the intent.
No, that was not, I know that was not your intent, but thank you.
So I think what I'm hearing then is a level of comfort with the description as it currently stands. Is there comment up here?
Well, it looks like, though, that the section that's a comment does limit it to 4 or more persons unrelated. And I know that there's other sections in here where they do describe, like there's one with 4 people related to each other and 3 that aren't. You know, it's...
Well, going with the mindset that the committee did, it just puts the burden on us to stay current on where those laws are and knowing.
Right.
And maybe we print them every 2 years and we put them in a book, and when somebody comes in, they have XYZ, we know we flip to the book, and they won't be part of the zoning code. It would just be a resource for us to have it at our fingertips when it walks in the door.
Is it likely to change that much, Mr. Schnall? Every 2 years?
I'm afraid that there were over 6,000 bills introduced in the legislature in the session that ended last week, and that of those bills, about 1,200 passed. And we don't know exactly what the total that will actually become law is until June 21st or June 18th, whenever the deadline is for the governor to either sign, let become law without his signature, or he vetoes. Traditionally, the governors in the past have vetoed between 50 and 60 bills a year, a session, but every year is different. So there will be law changes. The Texas Municipal League issues a weekly legislative newsletter. The newsletter that came out last Friday was, I believe, 58 pages long, and of those 58 pages, 55 pages had mini bill summaries of bills that had passed. So 55 pages of bills that passed, the Texas Municipal League, which is our trade organization as a city, believes are relevant to cities' concerns. I have a list of 25 of those bills. I'm on page 26 of that newsletter. I have at least 25 bills, which I'm going to have my assistant print for me to read the next time I go on an airplane.
Yeah, I did some light reading. I only came up with like 6, and I didn't get through but a couple of pages.
Yeah, I
It's-
mean, so
it's
yeah,
Wild West.
that's a long answer to yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
these are, the legislature is likely to change any number of things at any point every 2 years.
For this one, then, maybe it would be
Simplicity.
advisable for us to hold off until after all the laws have passed or been vetoed, and then we know what we're dealing with. And I'm like you, I don't have any objection to the definition as it is, and I also don't have any objection to the suggested alternate language. It further defines it, but if one of them is going to be in jeopardy of being outdated by the new laws being passed, I don't see there's any point of us doing it now.
Other comments? Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, you know, as I listen to all this discussion, and we want to move this process forward, I don't think this is quite ready for us to look at. I think you guys have done a terrific job of a lot of work, it's obvious. But I think the comments that the city staff have provided are very thorough, very detailed. I think they strengthen the code, which is why they're put in there. But they may be overly stringent, I don't know. But I think that the committee should go back and look at these comments. I would suggest that we just go through the red lines and accept, work with those. That'll move us forward. And then it goes back to the committee to address these comments, and then we go through the red line again. Otherwise, we're just going to sit here, we're going to be here forever and not make any progress.
And Mr. Flynn and Mr. Chair, that's fine with me, but the city council basically term limited the zoning review committee and instructed that we get our work done in 6 months. Due to some unfortunate circumstances, we got finished in 8 months. The last time before this, we had a zoning review process. It took 2.5 years. So we did a good job. We moved it along. If the wish of the zoning commission is to refer this back to the committee, I think under the circumstances, it would be appropriate to make that recommendation to city council, so city council could then reactivate the committee. Just a procedural step. But because of the way the council's directive to the committee was set up, I think it'd be appropriate for the council to send it back to the committee based on y'all's recommendation.
I think we're very close, we've got all the work in there, it's just the verbiage and the decision-making. And you said the first time that took 2.5 years, and you were tasked to do this in 6 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but you've gone 2 months, a little longer. I don't see why asking for an extension of another month or two would cause any problem, especially since the first time it took 2.5 years.
I guess my question on that would be, what makes us think that the committee will move any faster than we will doing that? And I think that perhaps we put an undue burden on the committee to say, here, we're just going to give this all back to you now and you go through it and figure this out, and you have 30 days to do it. I think, and Mr.
I don't know if 30 days is enough, and maybe 2 months, maybe 3, maybe another 6 months, I don't know.
My view is the committee made its recommendation. I value the work of the committee. I think it was well thought out. That is not to diminish whatsoever the comments of the city staff, but when I look at this, I think the question is, the committee looked at this and in most of these cases, did not feel a need to add language to it. If the staff has recognized a deficiency in the language that is currently there, then I think that flag needs to be raised. I think it's very valuable to have these other comments because it gives us perspective. But the difference between an observation and a notice that we feel this language is deficient, I think are two different things. So again, Ms. Thielen, I think a lot of this is, you know, again, I very much appreciate it. Are there specific things that are causing you concern that we should be aware of as we go through this?
Through this process, I became very overzealous, and I appreciate your brevity. I think that's a better process. And I mean, it was very apparent with the change in the state laws that are upcoming. There's two or three things that we run into on a daily basis that are problematic. Language that's almost there but not quite there. Parking would be so much easier to utilize in a matrix as opposed to how it's piecemealed, a piece here and a piece there. And some places you don't have any parking requirements for a zoning district that apply to the uses that are allowed there. So I think the parking matrix would probably be the only other thing. And then there's a few odds and ends in each of the zoning districts that are just a little strange nuances where like a piece of language may have gotten left out. Those are kind of some of the things. And then the SUP with the vegetation, those were really our bigger issues. This was just, you know, kind of an extreme attempt.
And absolutely, again, appreciate the thoroughness of it, but we're in the basic definitions. We haven't even gotten into the ordinance yet.
What I would like-
we're hitting a wall.
Could
So
I
think-
go through and just, on another time, not tonight, and pick the 5 or 6 that I know we run across on a daily basis that it would be in our comfort zone to have those particular definitions in there, and then we can withdraw a lot of those other comments that are susceptible to state law changes, that, you know, those type of issues that we could take out.
Okay, so on that note, here's what I think I would like to suggest, that we return to a page-by-page look at exceptions. So language that is currently there that was recommended by the committee would remain in place unless you have an exception that is either to what is currently there or you feel that the comment pointed out by staff is worthy of further discussion. Okay, please, Mr. Flynn, you okay with that?
Yeah, I'm okay with it. I mean, I think, yeah, we just go through the text, and then the ones that they really need clarification on, we can address those later.
Yeah, so I think that the direction from this would be, there is so much input now that we need help to understand what is really critical to making this the best ordinance that it can be, yet the most efficient ordinance that it can be. And where we feel that language is not necessary to further describe something or articulate something, that we would be comfortable moving past that. That would mean that when we next met, you would still have all this to be able to compare to whatever is brought forward again. So if we have any second doubts or questions, we can bring them up still.
Right. What I would envision this second iteration being is all this red line will be accepted that we've discussed. And then only a few key comments will still be left for our discussion. That's how I would envision from what we've talked about. That's how I'd envision it.
So when you talk about the red lines being accepted, I think maybe what I misunderstood earlier when you said that was that was accepting all the comments as well. That was not.
No, but by red
What you
line,
meant.
by red line, unless by exception, if we go through the red line and I don't have an exception with the changes, we accept it. If there are issues that we take, if there are areas where we take issue with on the red line, or the comments, we discuss that, and, you know, then we accept it. And then after we've done that, the next iteration will just have a few key comments that are causing the staff heartburn, and that's what we would discuss the next
Okay.
time around.
I agree.
That work?
Totally agree. So Janet needs to speak up if we get to something that she doesn't
Yep.
concur with.
Okay, thank you all. Not an easy process. Let's go to page 2. Are there exceptions or comments on page 2?
None other than the ones I made about the assisted living. I think we should hold that off until after the legislature's finalized whatever the rules are going to be.
Or leave
And
it
I
as
have no-
simple as it is right here.
I like it simple.
Yeah.
Anything else on page 2?
Brick material, I have a question. Is that the same as masonry or is it different?
The Texas Masonry Council they have some definitions, and then there's been some, this is getting way off in the weeds. There are some products that are probably not quite brick. We'll leave that to the building inspector.
Okay. Because they talk about different materials. So there's one that's the brick material and then there's one that's masonry. So I didn't know if they were interchangeable, not interchangeable. I think it creates confusion because I had that.
Well, and there are brick products that are acceptable.
that are masonry.
Very thin, but it is a fired product that is recognized as a brick. And that would actually probably need to be addressed more in Chapter 8, building than zoning.
Okay.
Strike.
In or out?
Oh, no, I think it's better to have a definition. in
Okay,
there.
just want to make
You-
sure.
You
All right.
wanted it in, or strike it?
It's okay if it's in.
Okay.
I think it's not enough, but it's better than what wasn't there.
Anything else on page 2?
Does that mean the commission is going to put in the definition of brick?
Brick material, it's like
Okay,
defining
that's
it.
fine. That's T2 from staff, but that's fine.
Right.
Just think we ought to clarify. Okay.
I'm sorry, Mr. Schnall, is there a reason that we should think differently on that, from your point of view?
It does, this definition of brick will work. The ASTM standards have been around a long time. They're not going anywhere. So I didn't see any problem with this definition. If you want to have a definition of brick, this is probably as good as any as you're going to find.
And we feel the definition of brick is needed.
Well, it adds more than what we had before because there is a section of the code that says new construction, you have to have so much, 70% or something has to be masonry. And I didn't really know what that meant. Does that mean all brick? Did it mean stucco? Did it not mean stucco? And so I think having a little bit greater definition is good.
Well, I think,
No, we define that in Chapter 8. It talks about brick, stone, stucco.
Okay,
well, it refers back to the ASTM standard.
okay.
And
Yeah,
ASTM
that's-
is the
yes.
standard
Yeah,
Yeah,
for building material and all sorts of other stuff.
right.
so it's okay with me. The amended, extended definition.
Okay. Anything else on page 2? There's only one other item on page 2. Yeah,
It's an hour.
let's move.
Yeah, I know.
Let's move to page 3.
Page 3.
Ms. Baker?
Cementuous fiberboard means finished wall. Is that an exterior wall?
That what is
This is up
commonly
at the
referred
top, like
to.
third paragraph.
It's referred to as hardy board,
Hardy board, okay.
a non-trademark name.
And so you know that I'm going to have some issues with this dwelling unit and what it means and what it does. At the very bottom, last paragraph, dwelling unit means one or more rooms arranged, designed, used, or intended to be used for occupancy by a single family or a group of persons living together. Y'all can read. Each installation of kitchen facilities consisting of at least a stove, a cooking device, or a sink shall constitute a separate dwelling unit. Why do we have to have this?
That's what your code reads. I mean, that's the way it's been. And if you go on further to the next page, there's a definition of a guest house.
Yes,
I know that this has been problematic and has come up in discussion. It is entirely the zoning commission and the city council's decision on how you guys want to describe this. At this point, you have guest houses or servants' quarters that are not allowed to have kitchens.
Well, we're also using dwelling unit on some of the commercial buildings, I think, which was, struck me as odd. I think it refers to dwelling units in some of the commercial buildings.
Well, okay, so it defines dwelling, and it means, it gives a general definition. Then there's dwelling multiple family, there's dwelling single family, dwelling two family, and then dwelling unit. So I have been a little confused about what a dwelling unit means and why we have to restrict how many kitchens can or cannot be in it. And then we further go through here and restrict, you tell people they can have them, and then you tell people, but you can't put a kitchen in it. You can have a separate house or a separate mother-in-law suite or maid's quarters, but you can't give her a fully functioning kitchen. I don't understand the purpose. I mean, I know that part of it is to design not to let people rent out their accessory buildings or other dwelling units, but I don't know if there's another way of handling that. It just seems very restrictive. Mr. Schnall?
This was
None of
language.
the definitions that begin with the word dwelling were touched by the committee,
No, I know,
okay?
but I still have
Um,
exception to this.
That's fine. I
And there are
think,
comments,
Yeah.
Additional language to be considered, inclusion of duplex. I'm not concerned about duplexes except,
duplexes.
and then the apartment, well, I still have issues with the number of kitchens. Or the dwelling unit has to have
You
a
really wonder, why do we
definition.
have this paragraph here? And I'm kind of, I mean,
I'm
I'm good.
Ms.
Scratch it.
Baker, I'm reading that paragraph
I don't know why
completely
it's there.
differently from the way you are. The suggestion I would make in the dwelling unit definition is in the last sentence where it says apartment units in apartment hotels are dwelling units. I would simply have that sentence read, apartment units are dwelling units,
Right.
and take out the phrase in apartment hotels. I don't read the previous sentence as saying that that to have a unit, you have to have a kitchen. I think what it's saying is, if you have a kitchen, it's a unit. If it's got a separate kitchen, that counts as a separate unit. That's what I'm reading it to mean. I'm not sure
But it further
I'm
has
saying
to
it the
define.
same way you are.
And you are correct. If the way you're reading it, then you could not have two of those on one single-family lot, because then you're outside the
Two dwelling units.
prescription of what forms a single-family zoning district. So you are
Again-
correct in how you're reading that.
Again, if you needed to do that because of a hardship of some kind, taking an in-home care of a family member, where you need to have separate kitchens. Some people have separate kitchens for religious reasons. Again, you can get a variance. I know that's a little bit onerous, as the chairman said, but there is that possibility. And if the commission is concerned about it, let's come up with some alternative language that addresses Ms. Baker's concern.
I would love that.
So the reference that Ms. Baker, I think, is citing is 50-61, which is on page 13, where it talks about generally in the A single-family dwelling district, no land shall be used and no building shall be erected or converted to any use other than single-family residence as an accessory buildings and structures usual and customary to permitted uses in this district, meeting the requirements of section 50-36F. Habitable accessory unit uses shall not be rented, but may be occupied by occasional non-paying guests and by full-time employees living on the premises who function as domestic help or caregivers. So what that's saying is there can be another habitable structure on a property.
That's true,
But
but what they
contrary to
don't,
that is what you're reading on this other page that says that if there's a kitchen, if there's a kitchen in that unit, then it would be defined as a dwelling unit, as two separate dwelling units, and therefore violating single-family residential
right.
definitions. I think you're in a little bit of a conundrum here based on the zoning regulation. And there are, families who have elderly parents who will live in a house, or they'll create a mother-in-law suite or something like that. They're not rented. And I think the spirit of the zoning regulation is we don't want somebody building another house on their property and then renting it out, are converting a part of their house to an apartment that then they rent out to someone else. That's the spirit, I think. And so we probably need to look at what do we need to do to this language to fix that, so that you're not being onerous on people who have caregivers, or domestic help, or elderly parents, or, kids that are living with their parents that have a separate cooking facility, or something like that, but they're not renting the property. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and Ms. Baker, maybe the solution is simply to take out the sentence that begins each installation. I'm mildly concerned that I don't know whether there are any unintended consequences of that. But I think taking out that sentence would alleviate your concern, and it would still, I think, deal with what Mr. Vanderwall was talking about.
Tell me again which sentence you're talking about, Mark?
Page 3.
The last definition on page 3, there's a first sentence that begins, dwelling unit means one or more rooms. At the end of the second line, there's a sentence that begins, each installation of kitchen facilities consisting of at least a stove or cooking device and a sink shall constitute a separate dwelling unit. I think that's the sentence that was of concern to Ms. Baker, and one option is to take it out, which I think addresses Ms. Baker's concern. And then the last sentence where it says apartment units and apartment hotels or dwelling units, we don't have any, quote, apartment hotels, close quote.
Right.
And that's why I would suggest we just take out those 3 words. So it's just clear that apartment units are dwelling units.
Does that address your concern, Shanna?
When you
If
go
we-
on to the next page, page 4, if you go to guest house,
Right.
that would support that language, taking that out, and then you would have a definition of a guest house where you put some time restrictions on them, but you may not want those time restrictions.
Oh, the 3-month or not more than 2
Well,
months?
if you have-
I read 3
Was
months
he-
and 2
we-
months.
One of his examples cited was, if I have elderly parents that want to live on their own, but I want them where I can help them, they may be there permanent. But then that creates a situation where we have two houses on one property, but it's not rented.
Right.
So that you get into some gray, and then maybe that goes back to an SUP. I don't know. I don't know how, this is your community. You guys have to decide what your tolerances are gonna be.
And the only thing I would add and ask Mr. Schnall is that last line that talks about apartment units or dwelling units, how does that fit in? Wouldn't you just strike that line as well? Because that kind of counters, again, what's over there in section 50-61, because it may be an apartment unit that you've got an elderly parent in, or maybe an adult child with special needs, or, whatever it might be.
I don't see it being a problem. It just says an apartment unit is a dwelling unit.
It becomes a problem in single-family residential where it's defined that there can only be one single-family unit on a residential. So then that would be a separate unit, making it multiple units. And again, that's something, as you pointed out, someone could apply for a variance for.
I think apartments had a different definition than a single-family residence.
Correct. Yeah, but back to page 13, I think you're okay, because it says you may have a habitable structure shall not be rented. But then you get back to occasional non-paying guests. So you're still stuck in a conundrum if you have family members, and that might be just enough to trigger that need for an SUP. Unless you specifically grant that somewhere in here that an SUP is a possibility.
I'm going to recommend on this one, Mr. Chair, that the city staff, work with Mr. Schnall and come up with what the verbiage should be between those 2 paragraphs. And then otherwise we could debate this one for quite a while this evening.
Can we get an opinion
Not on
from
this
them,
one.
what they feel on
I'll
this?
let them, right.
I was just asking Ms. Baker if she wanted to make a recommendation on this. Thank you. We'll look to staff and Mr. Schnall to bring us back
We'll
a
tighten that up.
solution to.
Could I get a little bit of feedback or feel from the board or the commission, what you guys feel on having a kitchen in a second unit on a single-family residential? Specifically, if it's going to be family, non-paying? I mean, do you want time constraints, or we're kind of moving back to a society where we have the boomerang children, and then we take care of our adult parents because they live so much longer than they used to. And so society changes, we ebb and flow, so what are y'all's thoughts so that we craft language that's not going to be offensive and come back to you and you say, no, that's really not what our intention is?
I'm in favor of not having this kitchen restriction. Dr. Deno had a huge house on Foxhall, and he sold it because he had terminal cancer. And he built a smaller house with a guest house in the back because he also had a special needs child. They were not allowed to have a fully functioning kitchen in their second home because of codes like this. And I just think that it's a restrictive measure that doesn't serve any legitimate purpose. I mean, he wasn't renting his house out. And most of the people I know, except for the ones that have houses that were always intended to be that way and are now grandfathered, that's what happens, you know. But when somebody builds a house for the purpose of having a relative, or I just don't see the purpose.
So you don't want any time limit on occupancy?
No.
I think we need to work on it.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Any other thoughts?
I'm in concurrence with you, Ms. Baker.
Me too.
Okay, I'm done with page 3.
Page 4.
Weren't we on page 4 a while ago, Chairman?
And
We were.
wasn't you, Mr. Aiken, that suggested we start from page 1? So, all right, page 4. Comments, exceptions. Is there that we accept current language?
All except for lot, a parcel of land having its principal frontage upon or having legal access to a street. There are issues with the definition of lot and how big it is, and it comes down to having multiple houses on large acreage, which is a personal issue that I have. So I don't know if I should not speak on this, but I am not the only one in this situation who has some large acreage and desires to put a second home on it. So I think some of the definitions on lot shouldn't be related to size, or that large lots shouldn't be unnecessarily restricted to some of the other lot restrictions about what's allowed to be there and things like that.
In many cities, the governing body has adopted an ordinance that allows the city manager or the city administrator to, without going through an expensive process, approve an amending plat. And an amending plat can often include just putting another lot line between to take a large lot and divide it into 2 smaller lots. So there may be a remedy for Ms. Baker's concern through either the existing subdivision ordinance or an amendment to the subdivision ordinance that would allow that larger lot to be divided into 2 lots, which would allow the building of 2 different houses on the same land, but the land is now not lot 1, but it's lots 2 and 3.
There are other issues involved, and one of them is homestead exemptions. If you've divided a large acreage into different lots, you can't claim your homestead on all of it. And for people that have wells, you're not allowed to have well lines run across lot lines. SAW will come in and force you to cap your well or drill a water line to the next accessible water outlet, which in our case is 500-plus feet away. So I agree that that fixes some of it, but it doesn't fix all of it. And I'm not trying to make this all personal and about me, because I am not the only one that has these issues or will come to face these issues.
And also get into areas of stormwater runoff.
Correct.
We don't have a minimum lot size. And, you know, if you take a large lot, how small can you divide it and put houses on it? So that goes back to the PUD issue as well.
Right. So maybe this is when we leave for Janet to amend?
We'll look at
I'm
it.
just raising issues. I don't necessarily have any,
It seems to me like we need to have some kind of definition of a minimum lot size. And I don't think there is anything
Those
that,
are in each individual zoning district. They're
Correct.
delineated in each zoning district.
okay.
yeah, and those are minimum. So if you're larger than that, it's okay. But then there are other restrictions where setbacks and stuff become interesting.
We
And
have,
definition of where your front yard, your side yard, and your backyard is, those also become problematic.
there was discussion for us to look at maybe creating a separate zoning district or a subsection underneath for estate-sized lots. Different cities call them different things. We've just run out of time and haven't prepared any language for that, but I know that that was a consideration that, you're right, it might not make sense that your front yard has to be X amount of feet wide if your lot is irregularly shaped. But is it an SUP issue, or is it so big of an issue that it needs to be addressed within the zoning code? And that's something for you guys to give us direction on.
Mr. Schnall, other than amending the plat? And do
Well,
we have a
I-
provision for that now?
Excuse me?
Do we have a provision with the city manager where?
It doesn't look to me like the subdivision ordinance is that thorough,
No, it is
Um,
not. They have to do
but,
full-blown.
but it's not a big problem to do that. The language about amending plats is in chapter, I think, 212 of the local government code. So there is language about what can be considered an amending plat, and then a city council by ordinance can delegate the review and approval of amending plats to its city manager. It's discretionary. Some cities have done it, others have not. But it's a way to alleviate at least the platting part of the problem you described. You know, you and I were on the committee that Mr. Isbrand chaired to deal with on-site sewer systems, and
Those were the
and
days, huh?
It was a challenge to deal with the issues that committee dealt with in a way that you know, respected the various backgrounds and the various issues that people have. So I hadn't thought about the water line issue, you know, for example. The appraisal district issue, I'd have to look at a little bit more, because I think there are some people who are getting homestead exemptions on adjacent lots, but I can't think of a specific example. I mean, the appraisal district can grant an urban homestead on 10 acres, and there's got to be somebody in Bear County who owns 2 lots that total just under 10 acres that has the homestead exemption on both of them. But if your experience is different, then you know, I certainly will respect that. I think the combination of the issues you've raised makes it appropriate for this to be referred back to staff at least, to see if some language can be crafted that will, you know, address those concerns.
Yes.
I just think we all need to be mindful of the least amount of intrusion into our personal likes and desires for the citizens of Castle Hills while we protect ourselves for those that might violate those types of things. That's obviously, you have to have a balance between the two. I personally think you should be able to do on your property what you want to do as long as it's in accordance with. And if you have to go to the Board of Adjustment or whatever it takes to request something, because Jan, in your case, where you, it's your property, in my mind, you should be able to, as long as it's within, you know, reason to build a secondary home there, in my opinion. So I think I'm very much so in favor of less government intrusion into us as property owners. I just want us to be mindful of that.
So we want this one to go back to staff to
Yes, sir.
bring back to us a recommendation on fine tuning that? Thank you. Anything else on page 4? Page 5.
We only have 60.
Huh?
We only have 60. I have no comments. Maybe later.
All right. I just could keep moving. then.
Man, I'm looking at memory care. I don't know, where'd you find nudity? Oh, there it is.
All right, page 6.
No comments on page 6.
Nor do I.
Do we, I want to just stop at the recreational vehicle one?
Yeah, I was just going to say, comment number 22. This, I know from looking back through various versions of the zoning codes that there's even some grandfathered, then it appears at some point the city kind of stopped monitoring the, I'm not real sure where we are on these. I know that we've had several people, including a council person, want to change the 15 feet because practically the bulk of them don't fit into that. And if we have grandfathered RVs parked in town that are behind opaque screening on paved surfaces, blah, 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 is it too cumbersome? Should we be allowing people to store them at their residence? I'm throwing this out for you guys. Give me some guidance. How do you want this to read?
Well, let's come back to what's the intent? The intent is to prevent people from,
The intent is not driving down your street and seeing ugly RVs in
I
somebody's
agree.
front yard or in their driveway.
I agree.
And they should be in the back or in an enclosed structure. That's the intent.
Totally concur with that.
Okay, and, you know, the 15 feet is in the ordinance today. The committee didn't change it. If the standard should be 11, 10, 12, I don't care. It's whatever makes sense to the commission. But that's the intent. The intent was to have a community where if someone has an RV and they want to keep it on their property, it shouldn't become an eyesore to the neighbors or to the neighborhood.
So are there a lot of 11-foot RVs running around? Because I haven't seen any.
No, they're all longer. They're all huge.
So what are we saying here? That
The
we need to-
comment is
So
that,
why do we need to make it smaller if they're all larger than
no,
that?
they wanted to make them larger, much larger.
There's a person lives across the street from us, and they have a smallish RV. I think it's probably about 15 feet. It's not obtrusive.
Well,
It's
we
not-
don't, at this point, we're not allowing you to park it in your front driveway or in your side yard, period. You call us, we give you a 3-day grace period. We
Right.
kind of fudge a little bit. It's supposed to be 3 days every 30 days. Well, sometimes you picked it up, and then when you get back from your trip 2 weeks later, you can't take it back to wherever it lives permanently. So maybe it sits for 5 days, all total. I don't think it's the end of the world. We're not, we're
But
trying
Janet,
to-
you can park it in the back of your house so you don't see it, correct?
This is, even with the opaque screening, this is limiting you to 15 feet, is what the appearance is, that's how it's being interpreted.
Now, I'd have more
no.
problem with somebody parking it in their backyard. If their backyard abuts to my backyard, I go back to backyard and there's somebody's
Right.
RV sitting there. I'm gonna
I
have
go
a
back, I
problem.
agree with what Mark said about the intent is to not have an ugly RV or trailer or whatever it is that is an eyesore. So what makes the most sense?
Well, that's why in other places in the ordinance, we have a definition here. In other places in the ordinance, there's restrictions about where you can park an RV. And so, right now, we're talking about a definition. When we get into the district regulations, we'll see that it talks about these kinds of vehicles. If they're gonna be kept within the city limits, need to be in an enclosed area or an enclosed backyard, meaning something with a fence that will shield it from the view of neighbors.
And we don't let boats be parked in the driveways, do we?
Correct. No, sir.
No,
Right, so that's the
Same-
same, that's the same thing.
same concept,
Right.
yeah.
So just looking at this in terms of a definition, the way I read this, anything less than 15 feet is not defined as a recreational vehicle. So what is it?
It's just a vehicle.
It's,
Just a
it's nothing and it can be parked anywhere.
So
I-
would
I-
it-
I
would
think
it-
we leave the
Well-
Would a
definition like
trailer,
it is.
would a 11-foot, 10-foot trailer be an RV? Would a pop-up tent be a mobile pop-up tent, would that be a trailer, RV?
We need to wait until we get into the district regulations. And the first one will be in the A single-family district. And let's look at what that says
Okay.
about what can be parked where. Because that may address your concern.
Okay.
Okay, and I don't want to skip ahead, because I like the way Mr. Isbrand is officially announcing each page.
He does it so well.
So you want to table this one?
Mr.
So
Aiken, did you have a
tables,
comment?
page
Let's-
6
hold-
is come
Hold on one
back.
second, let me just.
Well,
say-
no, my only comment is I am a boat guy and I'm a travel trailer guy. So I'm always pulling something in and out. So my thought is if it's something less than 15 feet, park it wherever the heck you want to park it. So I'm not for reducing that size. You have something that's 14 feet long, I say you park it where you park it. I did read all the recreational vehicles in the park, in the back. We read the parts that we're interested in. And I know there's a lot of information, so
Yeah.
I'm not for making it more restrictive. And that's why I asked earlier, how many RVs are smaller than 15 feet? I haven't seen any, not in Castle Hills. I've seen a few places, but there's not many RVs smaller than 15 feet. So I don't think it's a problem to leave it like it is. I don't want to reduce it to 11 feet.
I think we have to remember too that we are going to have a public hearing on this, right? So people will have the opportunity to raise those.
I mean,
these
most
issues.
RVs are, you can't buy an RV that I want to get in that's less than 22 feet.
Right.
long.
That's right.
So,
I think it depends on what you mean by an RV.
right.
So we will leave this as is for the moment
Yes.
and continue on. Anything else on page 6? Page 7.
I don't like talking about short-term rentals. Well, I do like talking about it. I do not want government to intrude into my life and my house and tell me if I can or can't rent it, if that's what we're talking about when we get into short-term rentals
That-
here.
That is exactly what we're talking about. It essentially means no Airbnb use of your home.
I think that's outside of our right to do
And,
that.
Well, from a definitional standpoint, it's probably fine to define it.
Right,
I'm fine with that. I've already circled it further back and
right,
said,
okay.
Well, we were going to discuss, we tabled this last time because
did.
the state legislature's been looking at this. And from what I understand, the state reached an agreement with Airbnb that Airbnb would pay taxes to the state. So, I don't have a problem with it one way or another, but I can see both sides of the argument. On the other hand, if they found some way of licensing this or permitting it, that we could tax it, that's another source of revenue for the city.
Well, technically, if they're paying hotel motel tax to the state, they need to be paying hotel motel tax to the city of Castle
Right.
Hills, if we have a hotel motel tax, which I don't think we have,
No, sir, we don't.
okay?
That's
And we don't have it because
We
the
don't.
community as a whole has historically not wanted to allow hotels or motels in this community, and therefore the city never adopted a hotel motel tax. The state legislature did have a bill, Senate Bill 451, which would have prevented communities like ours from prohibiting short-term rentals. It is a hot-button issue. SB 451 did not pass. The city can restrict rentals and can prohibit short-term rentals. Other communities like ours have done that. Not all, but some. It is a community by community, and in our case, it can be a zoning district by zoning district decision.
We have had complaints on one in particular. We were directed by city manager to notify them that they were in violation of the zoning code, that they were renting, and we didn't allow rentals in single-family short-term rentals. Don't ask me how we went on this path, but we did. They said that they closed it. It's still on Airbnb, and it's still being rented. There's about 11 or 12 of these that are listed with Airbnb in our community right now. We haven't checked with other services because there's more than just Airbnb. The only concern that consistently comes up is the house that ends up being vacant more than it's lived in. Nobody really truly lives in it, and it becomes the bachelor party house and the noise and the parking. What drew attention to the one house that we did get complaints on were the vast number of cars constantly parking in and out, and it was the revolving door of different license plate states is what caught the people's attention. I don't know that we had a real leg to stand on, but we sent them a stop-it letter, so.
So the reason I'm interested in it, I'm not renting out my house, but, you know, I think about my nephew and niece that live in Austin. And I think I told this story last time we were here. So they live on basically 15th Street, just past Congress. When South by Southwest comes in, they move out of their house for 10 days. They're a 35-year-old, they're both about 35. They rent their house out for over $1,000 a night. They pick up $10,000, and it's such a good deal for them. And it's a 10-day period. I'm thinking, I don't know, will San Antonio ever have South by Southwest? Will we ever have the Pope come into town again? I remember it was here before.
Well,
You know, and do we want to restrict that? And I don't know if we want to or not. I mean, that's such a good deal for my niece and nephew to have.
The city
They
council
put so much money in their pocket.
did allow during Hemisphere it's either I think it was a 1-month period, city council passed an ordinance, because in my spare time, I read all the old zoning minutes, the old city council minutes. And they did allow short-term rentals of people's homes in Castle Hills during Hemisphere. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe that's a way to think about it. I just know what they do and how important it is for them and how much money they make in such a short period of time. And you talk about the motel tax. So Austin has this. They've got to go down to the city hall, pay $200 to get a permit, then they got to pay the motel tax. Guess what they do? Nada. Why? Because it's a pain in the butt. Which is the same thing, you know, so that's the other side. Are we going to make it, Castle Hill's not going to make $1 off of this.
well, the other problem
we
with
allow
hotel
it.
motel is that the use is very specific what the money can be spent on, and we don't have a civic center, we don't have visitors bureau, we don't have any of those things that the funds can legally be
The funds,
spent on.
the funds can be used to promote tourism and for historical preservation. And there are a couple other things, but those are the main two.
It's pretty
that-
limited.
Those are the main two that little cities can use that kind of revenue for.
This is clearly a hot button for me, because I will never rent out my house as an Airbnb, but I will never say my neighbor can't. And
Okay.
so,
But I might for $1,000 a night.
And I agree with the
Well,
first half.
it seems to me
I
that,
agree with the first half of what you said, but I'll be darned if I'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the
Right.
morning with the
And
college
I
kids
think-
that's why
coming
we
in
have a
drunk.
police
that's
force.
well, I think that's the
Hell
crux
no.
of the matter. I mean, who's it benefiting? It's benefiting a few
Yeah.
with a possible distress of a lot more.
Does
know,
it have
so-
to be in zoning?
There's a
I'm
benefit-
just saying
there's a benefit
less
cost- there's a
government
benefit cost.
intrusion.
I get that. But there's also a benefit cost issue
Right.
involved too. And who's benefiting? A few people at the detriment possibly of many more.
Okay.
And
Let
that's
me-
not, and that's what a government is supposed to do. It's supposed to look out for the majority of the people.
Let me ask a question here. If we were to be okay with Airbnbs, would we need a definition of short-term rental?
I think so, for other reasons that are non-Airbnb, people that aren't, well, I guess I need to think about it a little bit more.
I think,
Think about that for a minute, and I'll get kind
well,
of,
last time we discussed this, thought that we need to have some kind of city council or public hearing discussion above and beyond what we're talking about.
when we put this document out there, we will have that.
Okay.
Okay, but let me finish kind of where I was going with this. If we were to permit Airbnbs, would we need a definition of short-term rental in our zoning ordinance? I'm inclined to think we would. If we were to prohibit Airbnbs, would we need a definition in our zoning ordinance of what that is? I'm inclined to think we would.
Yep.
We're in the definitions.
way, we need a
We're in the
definition.
definitions.
Great.
And I think this is obviously going to be a real interesting discussion when we get there. I think we need to get past definitions.
Sure.
And the question is, do we need a definition of short-term rental? I think we do. I think this should be in here. And we'll address whether we allow them or don't allow them when we get further into the ordinance.
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah, because the way this reads now, it's 30 consecutive days, so that's like a month of it. But if you skipped it around and only rented it one day a month, it seems like you could avoid this short-term rental definition.
No, ma'am, not at
No,
all.
shorter than
Not at
30
all.
days.
Not
So-
at all.
So you have to,
You have to
30
rent for
plus.
at least 30 days to not be a short-term rental if this is the definition. Okay?
30 days seems like a long period to me.
Well, it's designed, in the communities that have adopted it, it's designed to prevent someone from having the constant turnover with the out-of-state license plates or rowdy people, et cetera. It really is a decision that does put friends on opposite sides of a discussion. I think, as the chairman has suggested, the definition belongs in the definitions, and then when we get to the single-family district, the debate is, well, are we going to prohibit short-term rentals in the single-family district? When we get to the duplex district, we may feel differently about it. But I think it's a district-by-district decision. My recommendation is the 30 consecutive days be what the definition is. Anything shorter than 30 consecutive days would be a short-term rental.
Agreed.
so I'll simply, I'm cautious about debating the policy or the practice here versus simply establishing the definition.
Definition.
Got it.
I'm with you.
Is there anything else on page 7?
This is your trailer, your utility trailer, and, oh, I guess that's different. No, it says travel trailer.
Looks good.
Nothing else there? Page 8.
I have a question on the vehicle queuing. It says a line of vehicles in which one at the front end is dealt first, and then so on, and then newcomers join at the end. So does this mean you cannot have two separate lines that attempt to join into that single queue? That looks like what it says.
No, it's just to say, this is what vehicle queuing is.
Yeah.
That's all.
Do we
And
really
then
need-
there's going to
So we're
be an
just
area.
describing, we're not,
there's-
Right.
If I remember right, there is somewhere there's a reference to vehicle queuing later in the ordinance. That's why this definition was added. It was added because there was concern about cars stacking up and blocking intersections and things like that.
Looks good.
Anything else on this?
I have no comment.
All right, page 9. Oops, let me stop there for a minute and note then that we have completed the definition section.
All right, way to go, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations.
Mr. Aiken, we owe it all to you, thank you. Shall we keep going then? Page 9, page 10, page 11.
Oh, I do have issues with page 9, I'm sorry, even though there
Okay.
aren't any changes. At the very top, it's B, building permit for a building or structure has been issued in accordance with law, you have 90 days to, let's see, and construction is begun within 90 days. Sometimes I think that 90 days is too short. If you've got to, and it doesn't happen a lot, so this may come back to the greater good issue, but if you've got to go and get permits to take down trees and
How does
put
that
in
play in
road
with
structures to your property, 90 days it's not a lot.
Chapter 245? How does, I know that that has popped its head up
I
in
mean, I
the
don't know
last few
why we have to
sessions.
limit it.
Well, that's just the vested rights statute.
Okay.
So, I don't think that addresses this question
Okay.
about the timing of the beginning of construction, but,
We no longer require you pulling a building permit prior to ARC, so that eliminates that concern that you have. The building permit's not going to be issued until zoning is complete, ARC is complete, and so that would.
Right, so what it says is though, is that you get your building permit, but then you still have to go and you have to get, you know, all the other stuff, right?
No, those things all are, those are, have to occur before,
Okay,
and the building permit comes totally after that.
okay. Well, if nobody else objects, I think sometimes 90 days is a short time frame for sometimes a lot that has to be done, but,
Before.
Then we're down to the prohibitions compliance required minimum yards, parking spaces, open spaces, including lot area per family. I don't know what that means, including lot area per family. What does that mean?
Isn't this straight out of local government code?
which subsection?
It's 50-3, prohibitions and compliance.
Mhm.
It's number 6, minimum yards. Except as provided in this chapter, no land shall be used except for a purpose permitted in the district. Okay.
There may be some language in one of the district duplex or the low-rise apartments that talk about lot area per family. I'm not sure. This language has been in here for a long time,
Okay,
certainly since 1995 and probably before that. I was looking in the building code to see if it had an answer to your building question.
It's been amended, and you don't have a current version in there, I don't believe, and it has not been codified.
my bigger issue, Mark, though, is on number 7. Every building hereafter erected, converted, enlarged, constructed, moved, or altered shall be located on a lot as defined in this chapter, and except as hereinafter provided, there shall not be more than one main building on one lot. So here we have one main building, and I can't remember if it was defined as also dwelling unit. Is dwelling unit the same as one main building? Because we had that issue come up about definitions. So here we have an old definition, which is main building. Is that the same as a dwelling unit?
No,
Okay,
no. A building's a building. A dwelling is where someone lives.
lives,
Okay? We're in a building now. It's not a dwelling.
okay.
That's
So if
my
you-
distinction.
You have an accessory building, so you can only have one per lot. Is that what this?
We're
I
not
guess-
we need to get
Yeah.
to the definition of ABSUs.
Well, this is again where I think lot size matters, and I think it's maybe restrictive to only allow one main building on a large acreage lot, depending on what main building means. That's what I have some concerns over. And,
Oh. A main building is not going to be a defined term.
well, maybe we should, because otherwise, how do you know you're in compliance if you don't know what the definition is?
I think in ordinary usage, main building would be the same as the largest building or the primary structure on a piece of property.
I agree with that.
So that's why I don't think we need a definition. I mean, this comes back to the issue you raised earlier,
Right,
which is the folks who have large A-zoned lots who want to put up a second house.
right, or a second
Okay.
accessory building even, if there's already a house and an accessory building.
If this says you can only have one accessory building, then yes. I just don't remember where that is in here.
Yeah, that's what it says, I
but-
think.
This is another one of those areas where I think a community our size is going to have people who feel that one main house per lot is appropriate. There are other people who are going to feel that if the lot can support a second main home, a second main structure, it should be permitted. So
Because there's
the question
setback
is,
issues,
where does the zoning commission want to draw that line? And where does the city council want to draw that line?
This
I
is
mean,
one
do you
of-
want to say, you could say, for example, that a lot in excess of 5 acres can have more than one main structure, or can have more than one dwelling, for example. Another way to get around that may be to create a PUD, but there are some acreage limitations in the proposed proposed PUD, or Planned Unit Development Ordinance. But that may be a way to address your concern. And I think that before we make a change in this language, it would be useful to when we get to the language about planned unit developments, see if there's a way to accommodate your concerns by rezoning a large piece of property as a planned unit development, which may allow more than one dwelling on a single lot. Because in the planned unit development, it's, as long as you stay within the restrictions listed, you can do a lot more with a lot more flexibility than you can in a normal single-family lot. So I'm not saying that does solve your problem, but just in case it does, I'm not sure we ought to tinker with this definition until we find out. And unfortunately, that's fairly far back in this ordinance.
Are there other comments from anyone on this? I'm good with it as is. And I think Mr. Schnall's suggestion is a good one. Let's mark it, let's move forward, and Ms. Baker, we can come back to revisit this if you don't think it's addressed adequately further down the road. Page 10. Page 11. Too bad Mr. Vanderwall's not here to see us moving so
I
quickly.
know.
Page,
Phone on.
page 12.
I do think we need to look at the comments for 50-36. I guess this is
And I
parking.
think that goes back to my comment about building a parking matrix as opposed to, because there are things that are allowable, but we don't have any provisions for parking.
Mhm.
So I think I'll work on that. I'll get with Mr. Schnall. I'm sure he may
Yeah.
have some
I think
comments
it-
on that.
I agree with that.
Outstanding, thank you. Anything else, anyone on 12? Page 13?
So the parking, then you're thinking that maybe we'll pull out all the parking references and go to a matrix that summarizes it?
Just scroll through.
Okay, you guys are going to really hate me, but I have
Nope.
questions on
This is,
13 a
Yep.
lot.
yep.
Accessory buildings, or the ABSUs, there shall be a maximum of 2 detached ones on any lot. Again, I think lot size matters. And then, except for attached, this is 4, except for attached garage, which can be in the side yard, and ABSU shall be in the backyard and at least 75 feet from the front property, and shall not, I agree with the not encroachment part, but again, large lots, front, back, and side become amorphous, and I know that there's definitions further in the code that describe what your front yard is, and it's basically whatever's in front and attached to the street. Side yard and backyard become different. And especially if we talk about the 2 houses on a lot that's not under a PUD. So I'm raising these issues because they may not affect everybody, but they are an issue that I think that we really do need to think about where we have lot size. There are a number of people in the place where, in the area I live, that have large acreage lots. And it is exceptionally restrictive when they want to do something with their lots. And I know that sometimes you say that the answer is to come through Board of Adjustment and all of that, and then when you look at Board of Adjustment, that there is no appeal process for 6 months, or you can't raise it again, and then or you could sue to get it done. That's a lot to ask of somebody when all they want to do is put in a house or another accessory building. I just think, I understand that it works on smaller, normal lots. It doesn't work on large lots. So my preference is that we either define again the definition of a lot, or one where you have to be limited to 2 attached or detached ABSUs, define the size of that lot, and then anything bigger, define how many more they can have based on the lot size. And the same with definitions on front, back, and side. Y'all got quiet.
Good points, and trying to think about that. I appreciate the perspective. I'm not sure that I'm not good with where this is now, and I'm trying to think through it in my head. I understand what you're saying, but I think in my mind, I want to be careful that it doesn't become, and this is an over-exaggeration statement, a free-for-all of what ends up, how many buildings
Right.
end up there.
Right.
Well, and what we're looking at is, and I agree too, I used to live on a lot that was 1.6 acres, so I can appreciate that. I'm now on about 0.7. But, I don't know that we can address the level of detail that you want to within this document. I mean, 95% of the homes, I think this probably is appropriate for. So I don't know that we can,
There's-
maybe the answer is going back to get to the Board of Adjustment.
There's at least 107 people in the west of West area that all have 3/4 of an acre, and most of them have an acre plus. So it's not like we're talking about an insignificant group of people. We're talking about
I
a quarter to
know.
a third of the whole size of Castle Hills and the people that live there.
I think I'm with the chairman. I don't really have a readily available answer. I know that we can't address every lot in Castle Hills within this document.
I know we had discussed
So, so I don't know.
in the past about establishing a limit to lot sizes or what was appropriate. Mr. Vanderwally,
Mr. Vanderwall, we need some answers.
we had discussions.
Sorry, my dad called, believe it or not, so.
No, we're giving you a hard time.
I'm sorry, okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Baker, go ahead.
We had discussions on whether or not there should be a limit, or say a 5-acre limit, and then beyond that.
Sure, and I think it's a valid point. The question is, how do you address it? And I think there's 2 ways. One would be to develop kind of a little, a matrix that says, for lots, less than an acre, the maximum of 2 ABSUs. If it's, between 1 and 5 acres, then maybe 3. If it's 5 to 15 acres or 5, if you wanted to do that. Or the other way would be to do it by variances, go through the Board of Adjustment for a variance depending on the property itself. So the question, I guess, is what's the best approach? And that would be up to the commission to decide on what they think the best approach would be. So just over to you. I guess that's where the discussion's been going, and I'm sorry if I'm playing catch up. So I never know when my dad calls what it's going to be about, so.
Especially at night.
So, Again, I'm not sure where I am on this, so I'm trying to think in terms of what original intent was here and what it is that we want our neighborhoods, our community to look like. So whereas I think the idea of a matrix is something worth looking at, it still leaves me with the question, do we want to open the door then to freely allow people, because you have an acre plus or 5 acres plus or whatever, to put an unrestricted or disproportionately larger number of other units on that property?
Well, let me play devil's advocate. It seems like there's already a mechanism for doing something like that with the variance for the Board of Adjustments.
That's correct, and I'm not going to speak for you, but I think a valid thought on that is, you know, what the appeal process there is if you don't get it through.
I mean, the matrix is a good idea. Other than that, you know, we're getting into specifics and defining, you know, every hypothetical
Right.
lot. So then the default position would be to go to the Board of Adjustments. I mean, that mechanism exists.
I mean, when you go that route, we at least give the community the opportunity on a case-by-case basis to look at the situation and determine whether it's appropriate or not in their view. If we write it into this as a blanket, then, again, free-for-all isn't the right characterization of it, but there isn't that level of, I think, review that perhaps is warranted, given, you know, the question of what do we want our neighborhoods to look like or be? Why would this be here?
Yeah, I think your point about the community, especially the neighbors, being able to have a say. You know, we don't even define what an ABSU is. You know, are we talking about a tough shed, or are we talking about, you know, something much more visible than that? I don't know. But I think that's where the Architectural Review Board and the Board of Adjustments comes in, because you have to present those, I think, photos and designs and things like that. And
Yeah, and when I talk about Board of Adjustment, I think what my concern there is, and maybe I'm getting a little bit off the path with this, is I don't think we should create a cumbersome process for these to be, for anything to be considered, that we make it so difficult for people to get through a process that they don't even try. That's not in the best interest of our community either. But I do believe that when we start talking about exponentially adding things that are out of context with at least what is the current nature of our neighborhood or neighborhoods, that the neighbors should have a right to have a voice in it. And I think that's what our current process allows, that perhaps by strictly defining this or broadly defining this, that we might take away from them.
Well, I also think that it's subject to the whims of whoever's appointed, and that'll be a variable that happens every 2 years. And I think having a basic limiting or expansive factor, one that's bigger than something as amorphous or better than lot size or any lot, I think that would be helpful. Because unless you have the larger acreage issues, you don't appreciate them. And you don't think that there's homestead, there's a water well. I can't even see the other house that's there. I can't even see the other neighbors. So I think that there are rational reasons why we would want it in the code and not leave it up to people who don't necessarily have that understanding. And yes, you bring that to their attention, but I still think it's subject to the whim of, and it could be a political thing too.
Well, anything is subject to that, you know, to the whim of whoever is doing, including what we are doing here. I do disagree with the notion or your comment that if you don't have a large lot, you can't appreciate this. That's like saying if you don't have a small lot, you can't appreciate the issues that a person who lives on a small lot
I
have.
can, yeah.
Well, then I don't think the sweeping generalization should be made the other way either.
Well,
I think that's what the idea of having
No, I-
these community boards and review processes
But
are
I
about.
think just the discussion here today, I can tell from looking that you didn't consider that the place is large enough that you don't see the other house, or that you have a homestead exemption that you have to be concerned with, or you have a water well. And also, that's why I'm saying no, that there are issues that aren't necessarily within anybody's framework until it happens to you. It wasn't within mine.
Well, and I
I'm
think
not
that,
trying to be dismissive.
and I think that's where the role of the Board of Adjustment
I
would
agree.
come into play.
I think we have to have some way to, again, protect ourselves. This is a concentration issue here, I think, right? For those that happen to have larger lots. And I don't have the answer to it. I agree with both of you. That as a larger landowner, you'd want to have rights, and as a smaller landowner, you'd want to prevent other things that might be intrusive to you. So I would think, and it sounds like we have, I don't know for a fact, we have less folks that have larger property for the majority of Castle Hills. So I just think there needs to be a process to follow. I understand what you're saying about the whim of those that are appointed. Unfortunately, we have our peaks and our valleys of that within Castle Hills. That's gonna happen no matter what. But you can't just open the floodgates and allow just anybody to make that change without it going through some type of a review.
No, but there is
process.
history that people decided that flag lots were bad. Why? Why are flag lots bad? But that was what people thought of in the 50s or in the 60s. And so there was also that push when we were on the septic committee, that septic tanks were horrible and they should all be outlawed and they were a detriment to the health and safety of the community. That's not true. So it's the ebb and flow, and I think having some basic guideline within this would be beneficial to everybody. That's what I'm saying.
Well, just for the sake of a little spirited sparring, I'll point out that septic ordinance review committee did not ban septic tanks. So the argument there probably is the other way, that there was a demonstration of our community being able to process the facts and make a sound determination in the best interests of everybody. And I don't like the idea of approaching this, that we should suspect that everything is ill-intentioned. I do believe that regardless of anything else, that we can all come together, a Board of Adjustment or anybody else can come together and look at things, listen to the community, and make a reasonable decision on it. I just like sparring with you.
I don't think we're going to reach resolution on this discussion tonight. Can we move on?
I really just want to raise the issue and make everybody aware of
I think your point,
that these issues are.
point's well taken,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah,
and
I'd
I don't
say-
think we can define every type of contingency, and I think, your point's well taken. You live at 20, 25 acres, and that's, I think if you make a case to the Board of Adjustments, like, no one's gonna see this, I don't think you're gonna get any complaint, and I think those are the balancing factors that come into play here. So, I don't know, I agree there is a lot of ambiguity in here, and I pointed that out. We don't have a defined lot size. I guess Janet said that it is according to the district. And then we don't have what constitutes an ABSU, other than it's a separate building. There's no size standard or construction standard or anything like that.
There is a definition. It's
Is
one of
there?
the first definitions on page 1.
Okay.
But please don't go back there.
Yeah, I'm not. I think we need to move forward.
Okay, so thank you for the discussion on that. I want to mark that as something to come back to as well. I think it's important for us to try to work through some of these things in the next round of it, so that when we get prepared to take whatever document we want to have the public look at, we have kind of baked these ideas. What else on page 13 then?
Mr. Schnall, in 2, there's some discussion about percentages of maximum cover allowed on the lot, and they're eliminating what doesn't count towards the percentage of maximum cover.
Where are you on page 13?
Number 2, at the top of the page. Second.
Staff comment.
Yeah, it's a
Oh,
staff comment.
Staff comment,
Yeah,
okay.
and help me out here, because this gets confusing on how we're counting impervious cover. I mean, technically, the way we've got it now, if a person wanted to pour concrete all over the whole lot and they wanted to pay the 40 cents a square foot, we don't have any way to stop them from doing that. And then we get into some, I don't know, this is confusing, and people ask us this question. And then, can you give me examples of doesn't rise over a foot? I mean, would that be, it's just that whole paragraph perplexes us sometimes.
The only thing I see on page 13, that's number 2, talks about the number of detached accessory buildings on
Correct.
any lot. Okay? And then it talks about the grade, and it says, it shall also not count towards the percentage of maximum cover allowed on a lot. Okay?
Is there an example of something that would be not rising above 1 foot? I mean, would it be like a cover on a salt, or, I mean, I just don't know what it would be, and it comes up when we discuss it, and I'm like, I don't know.
I frankly can't think of anything that would be a accessory building that doesn't go at least a foot above ground.
Yeah, I don't,
I agree.
I don't know what that
I
is.
think this is a definition that was unchanged.
We can leave it, I just was curious, it was just
You
me
know.
asking for clarification.
Chicken coops, maybe. They don't have to be too tall.
We don't issue building permits for those if they don't have electricity in them. Now, if the thing got to be gigantic, but it is an ABSU, that's one of those gray areas. Thoughts on that? Like chicken coops? Yeah, they're taller than a foot.
I don't know.
I don't know. That's an odd one. And my last comment is just it's to throw out for you guys to think about. We have lots and lots of nice, happy residents come in, and they bring in their picture of their tough shed, and they're very excited about this. It's going to be built out of a masonry product of hardy board, which our code in Chapter 8 specifically prohibits it. And they want to build a shed, build it larger than 120 square feet. You guys have any thoughts on that? It has to be stone, stucco, or brick.
Is there a reason why it should have to be that?
I think when the product first came out, it was all just those single sheets, and when you seam them together where the caulk is, they look terrible after 5 years. Now we've gone to a lap board that properly installed looks fantastic, but the single sheet ones do still look pretty rough. Is that where I kind of think that's the thought process behind it, you're seeing with other cities?
The thought process was that we didn't want to have a huge, ugly
Right.
steel building that the neighbor could see. That's the main issue.
When
That
we get
was what this was coming from.
to the district, it says that if it's over 120 square feet, then it has to be stone, stucco, or brick. And that we're seeing so many people come in going, but I wanted to go to the next size up, and I don't want to put stone, stucco, or brick on it. So I don't know if we want to enlarge that for cementous fiber buildings when we get to that section.
That wouldn't be the place to do it.
Okay,
This is fine as it is.
yes,
Yeah.
okay.
I can't remember.
Can I ask on item 8,
It's not a building.
when we define what something shall not be constructed of, when we define what something shall not be, does that leave then the interpretation that it can be anything else?
No, it's addressed later in the individual districts.
I'm sorry.
It's addressed in the individual districts, like
Okay.
the material. My only other comment was where I highlighted the word reserved. We have no specific lighting performance standards.
Mhm.
It does come up to be problematic sometimes. We're asking, when they do a commercial construction, that they bring us lighting plans as part of, do we have any other desire to regulate lighting at all? Other cities do. I don't know if we might want to look at that. I looked at Cibolos, theirs was really not over the top, but it looked kind of good. Do you, I mean, I can email it
Could
to
you
all of
share,
you.
yeah, would you share that
Yeah.
with us? Give us something, I think it would be
Thoughts
helpful
on
in
lighting
determining if we
standards,
want-
Mr. Schnall? Should they be in zoning or should they be elsewhere?
You know, we used to always deal with lighting at the zoning commission when we considered an SUP request. Lighting didn't seem to be an issue in the single-family or small lot districts, but I think that lighting probably is best covered in the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
So if there needs to be some language about, you know, lighting not to intrude on neighboring lots or things like that, this is the place to put it.
Simplistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have had a couple of neighbors that are in a tiff over a light, so.
Yeah, so if you could send us what you think is the.
And I'll
what
do
you've
some more
seen
homework on it. I'll give you a couple of different samples so that you
Great,
can look.
thank you.
Okay.
Other comments?
Are we going to ask for any consideration or a relook? I know Janet had talked about doing lot size and ABSUs and square footage of the ABSU and how big your lot is, and tailoring this number 2 on page 13 toward some more defined parameters.
I will look for additional language
Okay,
to
because I know
provide to
we
you
had
next
talked
time.
about it.
And I have looked at a few. I've started a little collection. I just haven't had time to try to mull them into something usable.
Okay, so that concludes section 50-36 requirements applicable to all districts, and then 50-61 use regulations. Beginning on the bottom of page 13 and over to page 14.
The comment T 37,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of took care of itself. The state law passed, and we'll see. I assume that's going to get signed in.
Yes.
Page 14.
Short-term
Single-family
rental is prohibited.
Single, we are in single-family district. Let's just clarify that because we're going to visit this issue a couple
Yes, muy mal. I have a question. It says we have to follow what the legislature's doing. If they were to pass something like this prohibiting Airbnb type things, does that mean we have to follow it?
We're a general law city. A general law city needs to have a statute or a court case that authorizes it to do things. If the legislature says that a city cannot prohibit short-term rentals, and we have an ordinance that prohibits them, our ordinance is probably void and unenforceable because it's contrary to state law. But the issue for the moment is there is no state law that regulates whether a city can or cannot prohibit short-term rentals. It's a community-by-community decision. And some communities, especially those who have experienced problems with tenants who were not respectful of communities and neighborhoods, have adopted ordinances prohibiting the short-term rental of property in the single-family residence district.
Okay, so my question would be to the city staff, is this an issue for the city of Castle Hills right now? And if so, in what regard? And how big is the problem?
This is the Airbnb. Janet pointed out earlier, there's 11 or 12 of them. If you go on to Airbnb, their site, and there's probably other sites as well, where people list their houses or even just rooms and a room in their house for
Right.
rent. So this is the same topic we were discussing earlier. The state was proposing that the city not be able to prohibit, but that did not make it through the legislature. So this is very definitely game on and subject to the previous discussion.
I guess my question is there a burden on the city from a law enforcement perspective created by people renting less than 30 days in their homes? I'm not talking about a tax issue or anything like that.
We've only had the
Are
one.
we having to send police out? Do we have compliance violations? Do we have any issues that are generating the need to enforce or say we cannot have short-term rentals?
It's certainly not a systemic issue. We've had, calls on it, but not, just one that Janet's aware of. There may be others. The issue, is that it's interesting because residents don't realize that these places are out there just right down the street from them. And when they do, they get very concerned about it when it's next door, especially. So, again, this is just going to be one of those discussions that I believe the commission's going to be divided on, and you're going to have to vote and determine which way the city should go on it. I can tell you that there are several council members who are concerned about it, and I will also say that this is there's probably an age demographic to this argument. The younger you are, the more you are in favor of it, and the older you are, the less you are in favor of it. And it's very much a European model. I mean, I've stayed in vacation rental by owners and Airbnbs when I've traveled abroad, and it's fantastic. But it does introduce a certain propensity for turning places into party houses. And, when
It just seems, well, and to that point, it seems like a lot of this discussion is driven by fear of what could happen, not of what is happening or what has happened, but fear of what could happen. Look at our good friends over in the beautiful city of San Francisco who just passed this, where they're basically, that's more on the tax issue. It's not that you can't do it, it's that if you are going to do it, it's up to Airbnb. Someone mentioned earlier that Airbnb had to make an agreement with the city of San Francisco for tax reasons. And again, my issue is not about the tax. My issue, again, is about my right to rent my home if I want to. And I don't find it's within our purview or our rights to tell our citizens that they cannot do that. And for those that say, well, it's going to be a problem, they're going to party, again, we have laws. And we have laws that are established to take care of this. We have a police force. Why would we possibly impose upon someone and tell them they can't do that? Again, I'm not going to do it, or I don't think I will. Mark, you said you won't do it, but you're more concerned about that guy next to you that wants to do it. Well, we have a police force here. That's what the police force is for, if there are issues. Now, again, we talked about another situation in another fellow city here in San Antonio that went, in my opinion, too far and passed it against short-term rental because it's hearsay, but from one person that was violating all the rules, and it was very difficult to deal with. I can understand that, but I come back to the old Vulcan: the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? I could never, in good conscience, be able to say we're going to regulate my house and who I can bring into my house for whatever reason.
Well, we're doing that anyway.
In some cases, we are.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing, just like.
This goes back to the big house where the deaf priests live, right?
Well, no, but it also goes to, I think, the mother-in-law houses. I mean, it's your property, but we're still regulating, the guest houses and stuff like that. So, not that I disagree with your position,
Sure.
but we are already doing those regulations.
I would just hate to read in the illustrious San Antonio Express News, Castle Hills, City of Castle Hills bans Airbnb. I think that would not be very positive for us.
Mike, can we get that table over by the wall and set it up here and move Mark's speaker there? So I'm really getting tired of seeing him stand up there. This is,
Yeah, and I can't see Janet. I want to see Janet's face. I see her hair. Right.
Tom, man, you are breaking all the rules here.
Let's take a 5-minute
That's
recess
great,
here.
agitator. Tom's an
This is a separate
agitator.
piece. Somehow
Probably
it
paid
just-
by, what's his name?
It just lifts off.
Yeah, we're only gonna call it quits. But he's still gonna have to, well, I guess you could set it next to him like this.
Put it over that way, will it not fit?
It's all about you, Mark.
Yeah, plus you can sit down.
Hey, I have a bigger question. Who brought this chair?
Not me, no.
Who brought them? We're gonna distribute. Janet, you don't have any idea who brought the cookies?
I'm trying to see what the election story is. She must be underway on that.
Hey, there is coffee back there. Would you like a cup of coffee? He's got, Jana's got 3 or 4 more. About to hand out cookies and Jana's got a little stash already going over there. You've earned at least 1 cookie. Get 2, Mark. Jana, question. You're gonna have to take both those now. Do you want a cup of coffee?
I just couldn't take it any longer.
That's all right, Tom.
Really, what we need to do is go back and conference room, sit down and just go over this.
No. We just need to give staff guidance on what you want done next. And try and pick up the pace. I still have a contract to write tonight.
You want a cookie?
Yeah, I had one earlier. I'm gonna leave for you guys.
There's also coffee in there if you want some.
I'm gonna pass.
You sure?
Yeah, those came to our office. I've already had 3 or 4.
Are you the one that brought them?
Yeah.
I didn't know where they showed up from. I'm looking at this box, Tom. Man, I'm a food guy.
We had like 4 boxes, somebody brought us like 4 boxes in the office, and they announced them, and usually they're all gone real quick, but we had so many boxes, they weren't all gone, so I said, I'm gonna take one in the meeting today.
You have one of those deals where like more than one person brings in donuts for the day and like everybody's sick of seeing donuts. 3 people decide to pick up donuts and, you know, it's like. Cups and stuff. I'm gonna leave these up here and let y'all pass them around tomorrow.
I like to look at them.
Tom was kind enough to bring them in, so.
I love that.
And there is coffee.
those tips trees?
There is coffee in here as well.
Yeah, they bring these. They will deliver them, yes. And so, yeah, and this kind of holds in all the heat. Really, oh, yeah. I'm not familiar with them. They have a couple of different locations. There's one in what used to be Central Park Mall, I forget what they call it.
Park North?
Park North, thank you. Yeah, they deliver them warm.
Wow.
Order what you want. Oh, yeah, and this box keeps.
Okay. That's the way, that it would be if I started, it would be a mistake. I know, trust me.
I should have.
Okay, we're gonna get back to business here. Just for the sake of recording it, we recessed at 9:12 and reconvened at 9:18.
Chairman Isbrand, I'd like to make a motion that we just omit any language barring short-term rentals throughout this entire process.
Okay, so you're gonna make a formal motion, so we would need a second. Mr. Gray, restate your motion, please.
That we take out any language prohibiting short-term rentals.
Okay, we have a motion to remove all language that prohibits short-term rentals. Discussion. Mr. Flynn?
I understand everybody's point of view here, Mr. Gray's in particular. I would play devil's advocate, though, like I've been doing most of the night, and leave it in there for purposes of discussion with the public hearing, and let the public have their say as to whether or not they want it.
Is the process such that, I'm just trying to make sure I understand how we would do this, because if, just for example, if we all said, you bet, let's take that language out, so we would take that out before the public would see it? I don't know if I have an issue with the public seeing that as an option to do. So you have now thrown me into turmoil once again. Right when I thought I was on top of it. Well, I mean,
I mean, your point's taken, Scott. But I think
I just
something
think
like
it's a
that.
bridge too far.
Yeah, I don't disagree
us
with
as
that,
a
but
city.
I don't think we're the ones that ought to be making that decision.
That's our job,
No.
to recommend.
Okay, well, I recommend we keep it in there so people
I
can
recommend we
can
take it
discuss
out.
Well, we can do one motion at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But we've got to go to the public with a document, so we either have it in the document that we go to the public with, or we take it out of the document that we go to the public with, and perhaps if we take it out of the document that we go to the public with, somehow it becomes a topic, which I'm fine with that, but it's got to be one way or the other, right?
But I would say taking it out kind of disguises it.
well, I say putting it in leads them. Right.
Well, interesting on both ends, but I think perhaps the difference would be if we were to look at each of the zoning designations where this language appears, are we making the assumption that we are going to be consistent from A, residential through everything of we want it in or we want it out? Or when we went through this process, would we perhaps as a commission say, we think it's appropriate in these designations, not in these designations, which then would put it out there completely for the public, if that's the case, when it came up, that someone could say, well, why didn't you have it in designation A? I believe it should be, or why did you have it in double A, but I don't think you should.
That's not a bad thought, maybe, so maybe to follow up on that, or to that's not the right word, but continue that thought. So we say, well, then let's take it out of the single-family dwelling, I think there's two chapters, it's an A and a double A. Maybe we leave it in the one that deals with apartments or multi-home units or whatever it's called. That way it's in the document somewhere and it gets discussed. I mean, that's a possibility.
That brings up another issue. If they do it in an apartment, that's an apartment complex's issue, isn't it?
Well, it's in here like
Then it
three or
becomes
four
like
places.
then it becomes like a sublet. So I don't know if we can even put anything like that.
That's an interesting point, because I travel quite a bit, and I stay in Airbnbs, in condos, in apartments, in houses.
Right.
All the time.
But if I'm if I'm renting an apartment from an apartment complex, they're the ones who are gonna say whether or not you can do a
So,
short-term
but
rental.
what if you own a townhome and you feel like you should be able to do it? Because that's,
Yeah.
It's in single family, it's in Division Two, single family district. It's in Division Three, AA, single family district. It's in, Division Five, duplex residential district. Maybe we leave it in there then. And I don't know if I marked it anywhere else. I marked it those three. It's in, Division Seven, high-rise apartment district. We have a lot of those.
So I come back
So
to,
it's in those four places that I marked.
yeah, I come back to, residential is residential is residential in my mind. If you're an apartment, a duplex, a condo, or a home, I think we should just remove it. And then I think if it becomes an issue, which it certainly could, then we address it then.
Well, I'm a man of compromise. So, but I
Yeah.
think the point's well taken. If we take it out completely, then it is probably not going to be brought up unless one of us brings it up or someone else brings it up. If we leave it in somewhere, it will be brought up. I'm a stronger advocate, I guess, because I own a single-family home, of taking it out from those two spots, leaving it in the other two I just mentioned. That way it's in the document and it probably will be brought up and then it can be discussed.
I could accept that as a compromise.
so, does that mean you want to withdraw your motion?
Yes, I withdraw my motion.
You want to withdraw your second?
Sure.
All right, so let's continue on. All right,
Well, can I restate my motion?
go
To
ahead.
say that, what he said?
Can I suggest something?
Yeah.
I appreciate the different points of view. I think before, we have gone through the rest of this and had an informal or less procedural process up to this point. And now on this issue, we're going to start motion upon motion. And I think we need to have some discussion, look at this, and if that's still what you want to do, that's great. But I would just ask, can we talk about this, engage what everyone's perspective is? I think we know what yours is, and I appreciate that, Mr. Gray. I think we should talk a little bit more about it, and then if we want to come back to it, let's do it.
Sure.
I believe the best thing we can do is to present our best work, our best thoughts to the community and say, this is what we believe is right. We may not always have agreed unanimously, but this is what we agree is right. But just to leave something out, which I think lacks transparency to some degree, or to just blanket leave it in, I don't think benefits it either. So if I could appeal to that notion that, can we discuss this a little bit more and then come back to if you want to formalize it or memorialize
You
it
bet.
that way?
You bet.
So with that said, we are in the section on single family A, and it leaves it as prohibited. I would like to get a sense, if you all have one, of how you, how you feel about that for single family A.
I'd pull it out.
You would take it out?
I'd vote to take it out.
Okay.
I would like to propose it so that the citizens have an opportunity to know that it's not a final decision. Their decision will impact the decision that's made, and city council may have a different view. We're advisory at this point too to city council. So I would like to see whatever we need to do so that everybody understands that there is an issue. We either have short-term rentals or we have no short-term rentals. I just think we need to raise that issue, and I don't know how the best way to proceed with that is.
Mr. Gray, you have anything, other comments you want to make on this one? Mr. Flynn, any other comments? So, Mr. Schnall.
So the way to address what I hear from, I think, everybody, slightly worded differently, would be if what you want to do is permit short-term rentals in the A single-family district. You leave the sentence in and you take the word not out. So you're giving the public awareness up front that this commission is recommending that short-term rentals be permitted in the A district, or in the AA district, or in the AAA district, or in the B or C or D district, which are the 6 districts which the draft from the committee says they're prohibited. It validates the fact that we have a definition of what a short-term rental is, and it also recognizes the will of at least 2 members of this commission, perhaps 3 or 4, that the person who made the motion and seconded the motion, I think, would be in favor of saying they're just permitted.
I like that, that removes that veil of not saying
Right.
it, so it's still there.
Right, so it puts it all out there, but again, to back to why I wanted to counter your motion with the thought is, I just want to make sure that what we're doing, we're looking at each of these designations where it's placed, and not before we even get into this saying we want it all or we want none of it. So, given the counsel of Mr. Schnall, which I think is excellent, let's go back to this item on page 14. What would the verbiage read? Short-term rental is prohibited, or short-term rental is
Not
not
prohibited.
prohibited?
Would you say not prohibited or permitted?
No, I think to be consistent, you say, well, either way, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
I mean, that flips it on its head. You know, we're saying it's permitted, but it's still out there for discussion. And like we've already said, there are still remedies in place, I think, that if they're creating a nuisance or, you know,
Absolutely.
there are remedies in place. But I just want to have it out there.
I agree.
So people for
I'm in
discussion.
agreement.
That's my only.
Okay, so then let's look
permitted.
at each of these designations, see if your opinion is the same for everyone or if the opinions vary, so we know in what language it's going to be out there.
A single-family district, how do you want it to read?
We have not yet decided
Okay.
that.
I wasn't quite sure.
You're far too ambitious and thinking
We
we're
were
going to...
close.
So,
I agree.
Mr.
Not
Isband,
prohibited.
Hold on 1 second, please.
what might be helpful to the commission is to recognize, and this issue came up and we just put it off on the tangent before, what size lot is the minimum lot size in each of these districts? So in the A district, the minimum lot size is 14,000 square feet, 100 by 140 minimum. In the double A district, the lot size is not less than 7,500 square feet. So in the double A district, homes are going to be closer together than in the A district. That might be a factor to consider in whether you want to allow in one district or not allow in another. The triple A district is, I believe, a residential condominium district.
That's correct.
So the units are not just separated on 75-foot minimum square foot lots, they're touching. Walls touch in a condominium. So, or there may be a townhouse district. I wrote it, I just can't even remember what I called it. But I do think that distinction might be helpful as you talk about where yes and where no.
Right.
Parking becomes problematic also. We don't allow
Let's-
street parking from 2 AM to 5 AM. We don't allow yard parking. You must be on a paved surface. So those are all mitigating factors for each individual residence as well.
But we would still hold and enforce our parking regulations as is today, right? I mean, if you Airbnb'd your house, they have to follow the rules of the city.
Yes,
They park in the street, they get ticketed.
correct.
My hope would be that tonight we can agree on what language we want to be in each of these references. My expectation is not that we are making any kind of final determination. We are certainly not going to vote on it tonight as the whole document. right? So I think, we are in these roles to provide our perspective. I think we should provide that, prepare that document, and then we'll put it out there. We'll let the public weigh in, and then we have an obligation to vote the way we want to when we have that final document put together. And then the council can consider whether it wants to pay attention to us or not.
Right. Well, I think the preponderance, well, I guess I can't say that, but it sounds like to me what we just discussed would be the A and the double A would not be prohibited. And I'm not clear on what we would do on triple A and other.
So you're saying A and double A would not be prohibited?
If I understood, that's where our larger homes, and then that's also our homes that are not as close together, and not condos, not apartments.
Single family,
Single family,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
A and double A, right. Not be prohibited there. And then I guess it would, I don't know how you'd do the other ones.
If you have a condominium, isn't there some kind of management group with a condominium or a townhouse, or townhomes? You know, so they could be the ones that would enforce that. I don't know.
There would be a townhouse declaration, a condominium declaration, there could be deed restrictions, there could be bylaws of those associations, and there's zoning. And the traditional rule is whichever is the most restrictive controls. So if, for example, there were deed restrictions that said every residence must be set back at least 25 feet from the front property line, and our zoning code said every single-family residence had to be set back 40 feet from the front property line, 40 feet controls. So, the city's restriction, one way or the other, might or might not control in each of those areas, but the city can go on record, permitted, not permitted, by district in regard to short-term rentals.
Okay.
Where did a duplex fall within the categories?
B.
It's in the, duplex is in the next section.
That's District B,
Okay.
residential district duplex.
So I think on our street, I live on Travertine, and we have right at the Travertine and Jackson Keller, some duplexes right there. And it would be, I don't know if it would be fair if they can't, but the house next to them can. It's still kind of a, I don't know.
So, without holding anyone to this permanently, do we have a sense of what we would feel comfortable with? I've heard Mr. Gray's suggestion that A and double A, that we put in short-term rental, is not prohibited.
And I guess your rationale for that is just because there's so much more space that it probably will be less of a nuisance, you think?
Well, I would think if, I try to even think of an apartment complex I'm sure they are,
Yeah.
I just don't know where the heck they are. That's gonna be just your standard parking anyway.
I would see more of a, if I had a townhouse, I'd be more inclined to rent it out on a short-term basis than a house.
Why is that?
That's what
I don't know,
That's
just-
kind of my,
just
that
a
was
gut
my
feel?
first thought too, yeah.
So I guess what I'm getting at is I'm kind of on the opposite spectrum. Whereas if I have a large family home that I've paid a lot of money for my
Right,
space,
right.
and there's a neighbor that's creating a nuisance, I'm gonna have a lot more problem with that.
Yeah, it might be a naive statement on my part, but when I think of condos and duplexes, my father, the attorney, used to call them cliff dwellers. Because they didn't own them, they rented them. So it was not to the benefit of the owners, it was to the benefit of the people that are living in there. They're more transient maybe.
In a duplex, if you have somebody who's rowdy, they're right next door to you.
Right.
And that's I don't know.
Well, then based on that, I guess I would be more comfortable going back to what I originally said about the A and the double A, not prohibited. Then we could say everything else, I guess.
If we want to raise public comment, that's the way to do it, is that we, if that's our leaning, is the A and double A, we say it is not prohibited. And on the duplex and the townhomes, we say it is prohibited, and that's gonna raise some public comment.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. I mean, I think the crux of the matter is the intrusiveness.
I agree.
And if you have a large house and somebody's, I think that would be less intrusive. Whereas if I'm in a duplex and I own it or I'm renting it, and somebody else is doing a short-term rental and they're renting some rowdy folks, that's gonna be a lot more
Right.
intrusive.
I want to rent Jana's house, just so I can see it. Must be huge. And the land mass.
Okay. In the interest of time,
I try. I try.
thoughts?
So I agree with what Tom said, that, A and
A and
double A,
double A.
we allow it. and
Not
triple
prohibited.
A and, yeah, and triple A.
A and double A not prohibited, everything else
Else
prohibited, just what you're
prohibited.
saying?
Let it fall out from there.
Yeah.
I think
and
that's a good,
And that's out there so people can
think that's fair.
discuss it.
That way, it's definitely going to come up.
Yeah.
A and double A, prohibited everywhere else.
Ms. Baker,
I am fine with that.
scratch your back, you scratch mine.
That's right.
Politics, baby, this is politics.
That's it.
This is Castle Hills politics. Don't put that in the minutes.
Yeah.
It's okay, you're broadcasting.
Oh, great.
Yeah, way to go.
I'll just say that because I know this is not our final, I'm good with the language being this way to move it forward.
I think so,
I
yeah.
think we'll hear a lot more about it, and then I think we'll all need to determine what our comfort level is. But in the interest of putting it out there for the public's discussion, and back to, again, the idea of the motion, I think it is actually helpful to have where it isn't as a proposal, because I think that will stimulate probably some greater discussion than just
Super.
a adamant yes or adamant no to it.
Okay.
So thank
Thank
you all
you.
for your flexibility on that. All right, we're going to get through, was there anything else on page 14 then?
The staff comment regarding whether it should be impervious cover or buildings and structures. And I think that goes back to one of the previous sections too. We have a continuing issue with the stormwater runoff, and we're trying to promote low-impact development. It may not be an issue because the city's pretty well developed anyhow, but for new structures, I think there should be less than a third impervious cover on a lot. Not just the house, but swimming pools, driveways,
Swimming pools actually act as detention, believe it or not. You don't fill it all the way to the top, so it does take quite a bit of rain to get it to the top. So we don't charge stormwater fee on that portion of development if they put flat work around it. We had a long discussion about this and finally decided from talking to engineers that they were comfortable with that. But it's the other issues. I mean, how much cover are we wanting people to put on there? And are we just looking at structures, or does flat work play into that? And Mr. Schnall, what are you seeing in other communities? How are they dealing with impervious cover versus structures, et cetera?
I think they're dealing it pretty much the way that we're dealing with it. We have a
Okay.
definition of structure that says, structure means anything constructed, erected, located, and placed on the ground or attached to something constructed, erected, and placed on the ground. A building is a structure. So this says, on page 14, it says, buildings and structures on any one lot must not cover more than 1/3 of the entire area. And it also brings us back to the discussion we had about xeriscape. So the logic here was not to change this, kind of like it's not broken, why are we going to fix it? And so the committee did not feel there was a need to change section 50-64E, that the buildings and structures couldn't be more than 1/3 of a lot. If your lot is small, your house is small. If your lot is large, your house can be larger.
So it sounds like the definition, the driveway would be part of that structure. Because it's attached to a building.
On the comment, yeah.
Okay. I'm good with that.
Okay. And I think it was for us more than anything in-house, that was always a clarification we were needing.
Okay, we're good with that then? And
Does that mean we're accepting the comments on T40? Where we consider that flat work is considered part of the structure, not to be more than 1/3?
Correct.
Of the lot,
Flat
okay.
work is considered a structure.
anyone have any comment on motor cars versus carriages? Okay. All right, page 15.
Motor cars.
My goal is for us to get through at least AA, single family, which is next page.
Get through it?
Mm-hmm. Anything on page 15?
I have a question on why we have a limit to 3 feet, 4 fences in the front yard. I mean, I think from the old days, it was so that the cops could jump over the fence if there were bad guys that you're sneaking around your windows, but I'm not totally sure that that's why.
On the fences?
In this particular
In the front
community, we have limited, very few people, they come in and ask for the permission to go taller, and it's, looking for polite ways to say this, you don't want to look like everyone is locked behind chain link, or not everyone would put up a nice wrought iron fence. Smaller lots, it would look quite odd, unwelcoming. You get back into the bigger lots,
Yeah, it's the deer issue.
yeah. And it's not just deer. We have people that their professions, they would
Oh,
like to
yeah.
have more security. And I think that was the thought process, how they got to that. And if you want the taller fence, then use the variance procedure to ask for a taller fence.
I just know that when you have to go through that, you're paying like $500. You have to do, you have to show all your dimensions. You have to show, what else? Gosh. You have to show pictures. To me, it was not as uncomplicated as it sounds by, oh, just go get a variance. It's not an uncomplicated process, and it's not a necessarily inexpensive process when all you want to do is put in a fence. I would be more concerned with what it was made of than its height. Yeah, I agree. You don't want wood fence all around the front of your house, because then it creates obstructions. The police can't see what's going on, and I think that's one of the bigger factors. You want them to be able to see. But other than why we have 3 feet, at 6 feet, a deer could still dump your fence, but it just seems like an ancient holdover.
The overall look, especially on our smaller lotted neighborhoods, would not be welcoming.
I agree with that. I agree. But then it's that size thing again.
There action proposal you want to make on this?
No, I
You
mean,
just
I
asking at
think,
this
I
point?
think the consensus is that, oh, that's what variances are for. So
Okay,
we'll leave this one.
I'm just picturing the 7-foot wall in front of my house, and now I wouldn't be able to have that there based on this,
Yeah.
because I don't want the police to see what I'm doing. Okay, anything else on page 15? We have the staff comment here. So we want to leave everything as is?
The only one that I really had comment on was, do we want to do the vehicle parking and storage over in the other, in chapter 44, where it's addressed in multiple places? Mr. Schnall, your comments on that?
T43?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I feel strongly this does not belong in the zoning ordinance. It belongs in the parking ordinance.
And B?
B, parking of utility and recreational vehicles.
Yes, sir.
Well, we want to, the sentence we are recommending move to chapter 44 isn't a use issue. It says on city-owned unimproved right-of-way. It's really not a zoning type
Right.
issue. Whereas what you park in your front yard or in your driveway that I have to drive by every evening or every morning might bother me. So we want to have these restrictions continued for where you can park a utility or an RV, vehicle or an RV.
Thank you.
Anything else, folks, on that page? Page 16, now we're moving into AA single-family district. Short-term rental is not prohibited, is our consensus on how we'll present it. Anything on page 17, we're now in AAA townhome, short-term rental is prohibited. Any other changes or comments on 17? Page 18. Page 19. Page 20, we are in B duplex residential district. Was the consensus that everything else is prohibited? Okay. Page 21. And that would be the proper language for, correct, what we said?
For discussion, sure.
For okay. Likewise with page 23. Okay, page 24. Page 25. Mr. Schnall, is it correct, the comment here regarding the question, the committee's language?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And the reason is this. Under our existing current zoning ordinance, and I think it was Mr. Floyd who mentioned this earlier, you can have a dwelling in the office district. That's not what we want. We want the office district to have offices, and we want the residential districts to have residences. So by having the sentence, any use allowed in the B district, allows a residence in the one-story office district. And so this language is struck from both the E district and F district by intention.
Thank you. Any other comments on that? Page 26. Page,
I have a question. Is that, on page 26, I guess, I think you might have just clarified that, because it says, in the E one-story office professional district, there should be an enclosed area. You're having single-family dwelling units and duplexes and, you know, in a professional office, professional district. So I'm just confused about that.
Well, I must confess that the committee missed that. So my recommendation would be that this commission should strike sub 1, sub 2, and renumber sub 3 as 1, or eliminate the numbers entirely. So we make it clear, top of 26.
Good catch.
So we make it clear that we're talking about office buildings in the one-story office district, not single-family residences and not duplexes. And we may need to do the same thing in the F district.
And that also goes to, maybe you already struck it, on 257 F1, it's referring to dwelling units.
G1 and F1 would also go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that whole section, excuse me.
good catch.
Yeah, and D1 and D2 also, correct.
Yep. Okay. Page 27.
On 27, I have a comment that it's under 50-284 use regulations, it's 1C. It has to do with one structure per lot. recently we had those medical condos that wanted to put 2 structures on a lot because it saved trees and it provided for better parking. So I'm wondering if, I mean, and they had to go, what, to, I forget, one of the boards for a variance to do that. Was it our Board of Adjustment, Architectural Review, one of those, I can't remember. So it wasn't a zoning issue, but it was one of the other issues. And I think that was the right thing to do, but I'm wondering if we shouldn't be so restrictive in this section. Because we're under F, 2-story office professional district.
I think it's probably the right way to do it, so that if they want to change from this, they do have to come back to us, as opposed to making it more liberal. I mean, that's my thought. If it's a
That's what they did.
Yeah, if it's a 2-story office building, there's a lot of stuff involved with that. So I would think they should need to come and change it, and whichever committee it is, looks at it and either goes with it or doesn't. I don't see a problem with it.
Everybody else good with that, then? Page 28.
Wait a minute, on 27,
Uh-huh.
have we also struck section 5285, where again, we're referring to single-family dwellings,
Right.
duplexes
for a 2-story office building?
Yeah, the sections that, starting at the top of page 228, I'm sorry, page 28, the very first thing at the top of the page, we'd strike the single-family dwelling 1,600 and duplex 1,000. We would strike B1, we would strike D1, and we would strike F1, because they talk about residences, and they don't need to be in here anymore.
So that's 27 and 28?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
At the very top of 29, A would go and B would become A. And that would bring us to FF, the office condominium district.
And is this also where we talk about the parking, we're thinking now this language is gonna also come out of here and go to your matrix, or I'm not sure I'm following exactly?
That is my intention.
Okay.
And I'll get it to you, and if it's not comfortable, then we can leave it as
No,
is and just go for
I'm just
clarifications.
asking the question.
Okay, page 29. Any comments on that? Page 30, 31. Okay, we're now into general business district. 32. 33. 34.
I have one question on 33. 5351, minimum off-street parking requirements. That pertains to all off-street parking, especially like 5351A. Installing parking spaces, parking area should be degraded and drained in such a manner there be no increase. That's for all parking spaces?
In the G General Business District. That's what, we're in the district regulation, so this would apply in the G District.
Okay, so.
And it is going to require any new construction in the G District to be professionally engineered.
So, I guess, all right, so that answers my question. Shouldn't that be the same for all off-street parking?
We're a pretty built-up city
Okay.
in the residential districts. I don't object to that at all, but I think the reason the committee wanted to put it in here was to make sure that if there was commercial development, that the drainage would be carefully engineered. We were very sensitive to drainage issues.
Okay, anything else on 33? 34? 35? And anything prior to planned unit development, so the top of page 36? Anything on?
One comment, and it's, way, way back, and I apologize.
Page 1?
No,
No, not again.
close, page
Mr. Chairman,
Can we
13.
just discuss it? I mean,
Can we just, go ahead.
I think we should just discuss it. It's basically what it has to do with is daycares, preschools, and kindergartens in this particular place that are associated with a school. So we have a number of our schools that have those types of activities that are associated with them. One of those schools is changing buildings. They've done a renovation, they've changed buildings, they're moving to another location. And they will no longer be grandfathered by the previous zoning regulations. And previous iteration, or previous revision of the zoning regulation removed the clause that allowed them to have a daycare, a preschool, or a nursery in a school that is in the single-family residential district. So it's the Christian school that's associated over there with the old First Baptist Church. I'm not sure what their name is right now. They're swapping and moving buildings. They've done a renovation, and they are just moving that function and activity to a new building. But they can no longer do so based on our current code of ordinances because it's changed from when they originally stood up. Other schools here in Castle Hills that are, to make the apples to apples comparison, such as St. George's, are operating as they always have with, kindergartens, preschools, so on and so forth, based on the old zoning ordinance. I think also with the Jackson Keller and Castle Hills Elementary. So for the sake of parity, what we'd like to do is introduce some of that old language back into the code of ordinances that allows an established school to be able to conduct those activities there. Because in effect, they are going to be out of compliance with our code of ordinances because of the move from one building to another.
What specific section are you referring to here where you want it addressed?
It's 5061B1
Page?
on page 13. I believe that you are going to receive a petition requesting from them that you amend the code to allow this for them. We've been bouncing it around quite a bit, trying to figure out the most logical way to do this because it is precluded from being an SUP. When we get into SUPs, you will see it specifically states that it cannot be daycares and kindergartens in a district zoning.
Well, are you saying that this is on page 13, everybody?
Yes, sir.
In 5061B1, where it says, "Non-commercial public parks, playgrounds, and athletic fields in public or private or denominational schools having a curriculum equivalent to grades 1 through 12, are you saying that should say kindergarten through 12? What's the change in 5061B?
I don't have the old book in front of me. It was way back,
They're also
85,
wanting-
95, maybe even 82.
Well, they're also adding daycare. Daycare is
Well-
different than even kindergarten, right?
Yeah, I think if we're going to discuss this, I'd like to do it at the beginning of a meeting, not 3 hours in,
Yeah.
and look more clearly at some of that language, because I think there are some differences. I'm not aware of Jackson Keller Elementary doing the same types of services that daycare would be.
Correct.
If you put it here. So I'm not quite sure that I'm seeing it apples to apples, and I'd really like for us to have the time to look carefully
Yeah,
at
I
it.
agree. That's why I say, what I'd like to do is put some language together for the next time that this body meets. So we
Great.
can put it in front of you, and we'll do it early on in the meeting versus at the tail end when we're running on ether. I
So,
And,
So
and
this-
Mr. Vanderwalt, can we also make sure that if we need to fix the SUP language, let's do them together?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and this was purely just an FYI. Know that this is probably going to be something that will have to be addressed. And when we get to SUP, that would have been a logical place to bring it up. My brain's just getting a little thin.
So is it their intent that, I don't know what their time frame is, but if it isn't passed tonight, what does this mean for them?
Nothing
well,
at
it
this
can't be
point.
passed tonight to begin with, and I don't think that we should feel a sense of urgency to rush to do it.
And we
Our job
agree.
isn't to accommodate any specific one request, but to be looking at the whole
And,
of the
and we were
zoning
looking at
ordinance.
an overarching we were looking at language that would be equitable. We have a school that actually retired as a school here in town. It's being used for training only, but if at some point the district was